Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came on a Thursday night at 11:47 p.m., during the second hour of the November storm's fierce assault on the Cascade Passes. Sheriff Thaddeus Keene was reviewing incident reports in his office at the Catitas County Sheriff's Department as the wind relentlessly pounded the building's western wall outside. The storm's fury clearly signaled that the mountain roads would be impassable by morning. The dispatcher's voice carried that familiar tension heard in the voices of those who work with death with professional composure during weather events. Sheriff Keene, there's a case of a hiker missing in the Blewett Pass corridor. The Forest Service received an SOS signal from a personal locator device about 90 minutes ago. The signal is coming from approximately 8 miles northeast of the summit, around Forest Road 9738. The caller is the hiker's wife. She says her husband went on a solo overnight hike near Tenaway Ridge and did not respond to the 9 p.m. check-in call. Keene felt the familiar weight settle into his stomach. The knowledge that what started as a routine notification could evolve into a body recovery operation before sunrise. The Blewett Pass area was unforgiving country even in good weather. During November storms that dropped snow measured in feet rather than inches, the survival window for someone caught unprepared was measured in hours, not days. He'd worked this county for 23 years, the last 7 as sheriff, and he understood that the Cascades didn't negotiate with human error or bad luck. "Do we have coordinates on that beacon signal?" Keene asked, already reaching for his duty belt and the heavy weather gear that lived permanently in his office during winter months. "And what's the hiker's name and description?" The dispatcher consulted her screen, reading off information that painted a picture Keene had seen too many times before. Beacon coordinates put him at approximately 47.3891 north, 120.6847 west. That's rough terrain, heavy timber, about 6,000 feet elevation. Hiker's name is Daniel Cortez, 34 years old, experienced backpacker according to his wife. Left the Tenaway trailhead yesterday morning with gear for a 2-day trip. He's carrying standard emergency equipment and supposedly knows the area well. Keene pulled up the topographic maps on his computer, studying the terrain around the beacon coordinates. The location was in a transitional zone where the ponderosa pine forests of the eastern Cascades gave way to higher elevation timber, cut through by steep-walled canyons that funneled wind and snow into conditions that could reduce visibility to arm's length. The forest roads that accessed the area were logging routes, maintained irregularly and designed for summer use by heavy equipment rather than emergency vehicles during winter storms. "Contact Deputy Thorne and tell him to meet me at the department in 20 minutes with full winter search gear," Keene said, making the calculation that this situation would require at least 2 officers and probably coordination with the volunteer search and rescue teams. Also, notify Ione Mercier with the SAR unit. If that beacon is still transmitting by the time we're mobilized, we'll need her tracking experience. Ione Mercier was a wilderness first responder who had moved to Catitas County 5 years earlier, bringing with her a decade of search and rescue experience from Alaska and a reputation for finding people in conditions that defeated less experienced searchers. She volunteered with the county's SAR coordinator and maintained a level of physical conditioning that put most professional law enforcement officers to shame. More importantly, she understood the psychology of lost hikers and the way people made decisions when hypothermia began affecting their judgment. Keene gathered his equipment with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned that forgotten gear could mean the difference between successful rescue and adding searchers to the casualty list. Cold weather clothing rated for sub-zero conditions, backup communications equipment, GPS units with fresh batteries, emergency medical supplies, and the personal locator beacon that would allow dispatch to track his position if communications failed. The weight of the gear was substantial, but lighter than the alternative of being caught unprepared when weather and terrain conspired to create lethal conditions. Deputy Wiley Thorne arrived at the department 18 minutes later, his patrol vehicle already loaded with winter search equipment that lived permanently in his truck from November through April. Thorne was a 15-year veteran who had transferred from the Seattle Police Department after deciding he preferred the challenges of rural law enforcement to the grinding volume of urban police work. He'd grown up hiking and climbing in the Cascades, and his knowledge of the region's terrain had proven invaluable during previous search operations. "What are we looking at, Sheriff?" Thorne asked as he helped transfer additional equipment into Keene's department SUV. "That beacon signal still active?" Keene checked his phone, where the dispatch center had forwarded real-time updates on the locator beacon's transmissions. "Signal's still pinging every 15 minutes, which means either Cortez is alive and activating it manually, or the beacon's automatic distress function is still operational. Either way, we've got a confirmed location to start from. Ione Mercier is meeting us at the Tenaway Road junction in 40 minutes. The drive toward the Blewett Pass corridor took them through Cle Elum and then northeast into increasingly mountainous terrain where the storm's full force was becoming apparent. Snow was falling heavily now, the kind of dense, wet snow that accumulated rapidly and created avalanche conditions on steep slopes. Keene kept the SUV in four-wheel drive and maintained speeds that balanced urgency against the very real possibility of sliding off roads that dropped away into darkness on either side. Thorne reviewed the case information on his laptop, reading aloud details that would help them understand who they were searching for and what resources he might have available. Cortez filed a trip plan with the Forest Service, which is good practice. He's listed as an experienced hiker with winter camping experience. Gear list includes a four-season tent, sleeping bag rated to -20, and standard 10 essentials. Wife says he's done this route multiple times and typically camps near a place called Iron Creek. Iron Creek is about 2 miles from where that beacon is transmitting, Keene observed, consulting his mental map of the area, which means either he changed his plans or something forced him off his intended route. This weather would be enough to make anyone deviate from their planned camping spot. They reached the Tenaway Road junction at 12:53 a.m., finding Ione Mercier waiting in her pickup truck with gear that suggested she'd been prepared for this call before it came. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, and the focused intensity of a professional who understood that search and rescue work operated on narrow time margins where minutes could determine whether they found someone alive or recovered a body. "Sheriff Keene," she said by way of greeting as she transferred her pack and emergency equipment into his vehicle. "I pulled the weather data before leaving home. We're looking at sustained winds of 35 miles per hour at 6,000 feet, with gusts up to 50. Temperature is dropping through the 20s and snow accumulation is running about 2 inches per hour. If Cortez is injured or his shelter has failed, we're racing hypothermia on a very tight timeline." Keene appreciated Mercier's directness. She didn't waste time with speculation or false optimism, which made her assessments reliable when making tactical decisions about search operations. "What's your read on that beacon location? The coordinates put him in rough country, possibly off-trail." Mercier studied the topographic map on Keene's laptop, her expression growing more concerned as she examined the terrain features. "That's bad ground for someone caught in a storm. The area around those coordinates is cut up by steep drainage systems that funnel wind and create deep snow accumulation. If he's taken shelter in one of those drainages, he could be under several feet of snow by morning. We need to reach him before dawn, or the search becomes a recovery operation. The drive to the forest road access point took another 40 minutes, with conditions deteriorating as they climbed toward the pass. The snow was piling up in drifts that made the road barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest, and Keene found himself relying more on GPS navigation than visual reference points. They passed through stands of old-growth timber, where the canopy provided some protection from the snow, then into open areas where the wind had sculpted the accumulation into shapes that looked like frozen ocean waves. The trailhead parking area was empty except for a single vehicle, a Subaru Outback with Colorado plates that matched the registration information for Daniel Cortez. The car was already buried under 8 inches of snow, suggesting it had been sitting here since yesterday morning as planned. Keene photographed the vehicle and noted its condition for the record. Standard procedure for search operations that might later require detailed reconstruction of events. "Let's gear up and move out," Keene said, checking his communications equipment one final time before they left the relative safety of the vehicles. "Stay tight, maintain visual contact, and if conditions get worse than this, we abort and call for additional resources at first light. Nobody becomes a casualty trying to rescue someone who might already be beyond help." The forest road that led toward the beacon coordinates was buried under nearly a foot of snow, forcing them to break trail in conditions that made progress exhausting and slow. The wind was driving the snow horizontally now, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 feet, even with powerful flashlights. Keene found himself navigating primarily by GPS, checking their position every few minutes against waypoints that marked their route toward the beacon's last known transmission point. They had been hiking for approximately 90 minutes, covering perhaps 2 miles of difficult terrain, when Thorne stopped suddenly and raised his fist in the signal for halt. Keene and Mercier closed up, forming a tight group as Thorne pointed toward something his flashlight had illuminated in the snow ahead. "Sheriff, look at this," Thorne said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that Keene recognized as the wariness that came with discovering something that didn't fit the expected pattern. "Fresh disturbance in the snow, and it's not from wildlife." Keene directed his flashlight toward the area Thorne had indicated, seeing what had caught his deputy's attention. The snow showed signs of recent disruption, a pattern of disturbance that suggested someone had been digging or working in this location within the past several hours. But what made Keene's professional instincts suddenly alert was the nature of the disturbance. It wasn't random or chaotic, like someone thrashing through deep snow. It was deliberate and methodical, the kind of pattern that came from someone conducting careful work in difficult conditions. Mercier moved forward cautiously, studying the disturbed snow with the practiced eye of someone trained to read wilderness environments for signs of human activity. After a moment, she straightened up and turned to face Keene, her expression troubled in the backwash of the flashlights. "Sheriff, this wasn't made by someone walking through or setting up camp," she said carefully, choosing her words with obvious concern. "Someone dug a hole here, then covered it back over. You can see where they used branches to smooth the surface, trying to make it look natural. This is concealment work, and it's recent enough that the storm hasn't completely obscured the evidence." Keene felt the operation's parameters shift in his mind. The transition from search and rescue to something that required different protocols and assumptions. He'd worked law enforcement long enough to recognize when something moved from accident or misadventure into the territory of intentional human action. Carefully, he approached the disturbed area and used his hiking pole to probe the snow, feeling for whatever might be hidden beneath the surface. The pole encountered resistance approximately 18 inches down, something solid that didn't feel like frozen ground or rock. Keene exchanged a glance with Thorne. Thorne, who had already unslung his pack and was retrieving a collapsible snow shovel. They worked carefully, removing snow in controlled layers rather than random digging, documenting with photographs as they exposed what had been hidden. What they found stopped all three of them cold. Buried beneath the snow and carefully concealed with branches and natural debris was a man-trap, a crude but potentially lethal device constructed from sharpened stakes positioned to impale anyone who stepped into the concealed pit. The stakes were steel rebar, cut to points and arranged in a pattern that would cause devastating injury to anyone who fell into the trap. This wasn't wilderness survival gear or hunting equipment. This was designed to harm human beings. Jesus Christ, Thorne breathed, staring at the trap they had narrowly avoided triggering. Someone built this deliberately and positioned it on a route where searchers would be likely to pass. Keen's mind was racing through implications that fundamentally changed his understanding of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a lost hiker situation anymore. This was either a crime scene or an active threat situation where someone had deliberately created hazards designed to injure or kill people moving through this area. The question was whether Daniel Cortez was a victim of whoever had built this trap, or whether there was something more complex happening in these mountains. Ione, how long would it take to construct something like this in these conditions? Keen asked, studying the trap's construction for clues about who might have built it and why. Mercier examined the trap carefully before responding, her expression grave. In daylight with proper tools, maybe 2 hours of work. In darkness during a storm, considerably longer. But Sheriff, this level of construction suggests someone who planned this in advance and had time to position it carefully. This isn't improvised. Someone prepared this trap knowing that people might come through this area, and they wanted to make sure those people got hurt. Keen made the decision that would determine how the rest of this night unfolded. We're suspending the search operation pending investigation of this trap and assessment of additional threats in the area. Wiley, I want you to mark this location with GPS coordinates and photograph everything from multiple angles. Ione, based on your experience, what's the likelihood there are more of these devices in the vicinity? Mercier's response confirmed Keen's worst concerns. If someone went to the trouble of building one trap, they probably built more. This kind of thinking doesn't stop with a single device. We need to assume that the entire area between here and that beacon coordinate is potentially compromised with similar hazards. The implications were staggering. They were conducting a search and rescue operation in terrain that had been deliberately booby-trapped by someone who either wanted to prevent people from reaching Daniel Cortez or who was targeting search and rescue personnel specifically. Either scenario meant they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple lost hiker situation. Keen pulled out his satellite phone, knowing that the situation had escalated beyond what local resources could handle safely. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Keen. Be advised we have discovered what appears to be deliberately constructed hazards in the search area. I'm suspending active search operations until we can assess the full scope of the threat and bring in additional resources. Contact the State Patrol and notify them we may have a criminal situation developing in conjunction with the search operation. The dispatcher's response came back with understandable confusion. Sheriff, can you clarify the nature of the hazards you've discovered? Negative, not over open channels, Keen replied, aware that scanner traffic could be monitored by anyone with basic radio equipment. I'll provide full briefing when we return to base. For now, mark our current position and be advised we're extracting back to the trailhead pending daylight and additional resources. As they prepared to withdraw, Keen found himself studying the darkness beyond their flashlight range, wondering what else might be hidden in the snow-covered forest. Someone had taken considerable effort to create deadly traps in this remote area, either as defense against intruders or as offensive measures designed to harm anyone who came looking for Daniel Cortez. The beacon was still transmitting from somewhere ahead in the darkness, but reaching it now meant navigating through terrain that might be seeded with additional devices designed to kill or maim. The hike back to the vehicles was conducted with painful slowness, each step now taken with awareness that the ground beneath the snow might conceal additional threats. Mercier led, using her experience to identify the safest route while Keene and Thorne maintained close interval, their flashlights sweeping constantly for any signs of disturbed snow or unnatural ground features. They reached the trailhead at 4:17 a.m., exhausted from the combination of difficult terrain, severe weather, and the psychological stress of moving through an environment that might be actively hostile. As they loaded their gear back into the vehicles, Keene found himself facing a situation that would require resources and expertise beyond what his department normally handled. "Wiley, when we get back to town, I want you to contact the FBI field office in Seattle," Keene said as they began the drive back toward civilization. "What we found up there suggests possible domestic terrorism, or at minimum a serious threat to public safety. We need federal resources and probably bomb technician support if we're going to safely search that area." Thorne nodded, his expression reflecting the same concern that Keene felt. "What about Cortez? That beacon is still transmitting, which means either he's alive and in need of immediate help, or the device is operating automatically. Either way, we've got a man potentially dying up there while we're pulling back." It was the question that would haunt Keene for the rest of the night and into the dawn that was beginning to break over the Cascade Peaks. Somewhere in those mountains, Daniel Cortez was either fighting for survival or already dead. And the person who had built those traps had created a situation where attempting rescue might cost additional lives. The decision to suspend the search operation was tactically sound, but it came with the terrible weight of knowing that delay might mean the difference between rescue and recovery. As they drove back through the storm, Keene found himself thinking about the trap they had discovered and what it represented. Someone had invested significant time and effort into creating hazards in a remote area where the only people likely to encounter them would be either lost hikers or the search and rescue personnel sent to find them. The implications suggested either a disturbed individual who had chosen this area as their territory and was defending it against intruders, or something more calculated and potentially more dangerous. The beacon was still transmitting when they reached the sheriff's department, its signal pulsing through the storm like a heartbeat that might already be marking a corpse rather than a living person in need of help. Dawn broke over the Cascades with the pale, exhausted light of a sun that had fought through storm clouds and found the effort barely worthwhile. Sheriff Keene stood in the briefing room of the Catitas County Sheriff's Department, staring at the topographic map spread across the conference table while exhaustion pulled at his thoughts like an undertow. He'd managed perhaps 90 minutes of sleep in his office chair before the first of the federal response teams began arriving, and now the room was filling with personnel whose presence confirmed that what had started as a routine search and rescue had evolved into something considerably more complex and dangerous. Special Agent Michael Voss from the FBI's Seattle field office was a lean man in his early 50s who carried himself with the careful economy of someone accustomed to operating in environments where wasted energy could prove fatal. He'd arrived with a 2-person evidence response team and a tactical specialist whose job description apparently involved rendering safe explosive devices and improvised weapons. Voss had spent 20 minutes reviewing the photographs and GPS data from the trap site before speaking, and when he finally did, his assessment confirmed Keene's worst concerns about what they were dealing with in the mountains. "Sheriff Keene, based on the construction methods and positioning of this device, we're looking at someone with either military experience or extensive knowledge of infantry tactics," Voss said, using a laser pointer to indicate specific features in the photographs. The use of sharpened rebar, the concealment techniques, the placement along a logical approach route, these aren't the improvisations of someone who watched a few survival videos. This is fieldcraft from someone who understands how to deny terrain to enemy forces. Keene felt the situation's gravity settling deeper into his understanding of what they faced. Are we talking about a veteran who's had some kind of breakdown or something more organized? Voss exchanged glances with his tactical specialist, a compact woman named Sarah Brennan, who had been studying the trap photographs with the focused intensity of someone mentally calculating blast radii and shrapnel patterns. Too early to make that determination with confidence, Voss replied. But the deliberate nature of the trap's construction and its positioning suggest someone operating with clear intent rather than random paranoia. Whoever built this knew that a missing hiker would trigger a search response, and they positioned their trap to intercept anyone following standard search patterns. Deputy Thorne had been reviewing additional weather data and beacon transmission logs, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he worked through the timeline. "Sheriff, I've been analyzing the beacon's transmission pattern. It's been pinging regularly every 15 minutes since the initial activation, which is consistent with either manual triggering or automatic emergency mode. But here's what's concerning. The signal strength hasn't varied, and the position hasn't moved. That suggests either Cortez is completely immobilized at that location, or the beacon itself has been positioned there deliberately while Cortez is somewhere else entirely." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that no one wanted to acknowledge. If the beacon had been placed as bait rather than used by Cortez as a genuine distress signal, then they were dealing with something far more sinister than a hiker in trouble. They were looking at a scenario where someone had deliberately created a situation designed to draw search and rescue personnel into a trapped area, which suggested premeditation and a level of malice that transformed the entire operation from rescue to criminal investigation. "Agent Voss, what's your recommendation for proceeding?" Keene asked, knowing that the federal presence gave him access to resources and expertise that his department couldn't match, but also knowing that ultimately the responsibility for any decisions made in his county remained his. Voss consulted with his tactical specialist in a brief, quiet conversation before responding. "We need to approach this as a deliberate threat situation with potential for additional hazards. I'm recommending we bring in a full evidence response team with explosive ordnance disposal capability, conduct aerial reconnaissance to identify any obvious disturbances in the snow cover that might indicate additional traps, and then execute a deliberate clearance operation to the beacon location. That means slow progress with metal detectors and careful examination of the terrain before anyone puts weight on ground that might be compromised." "How long are we talking about for that kind of operation?" Thorne asked, voicing the question that Keene was thinking. If Cortez is actually alive up there, every hour we delay reduces his survival chances. It was the eternal tension in search and rescue operations, the balance between speed and safety, between the moral imperative to help someone in distress and the practical reality that adding casualties to a situation didn't save anyone. Voss's expression suggested he'd faced this calculation many times before and had never found an answer that satisfied all competing requirements. Realistically, with current weather conditions and the terrain involved, we're looking at a minimum of 6 hours to reach the beacon location safely, Voss said. And that's assuming we don't encounter additional hazards that require time to assess and neutralize. Sheriff, I understand the urgency, but sending personnel into a trapped area in these conditions is more likely to create additional casualties than effect a successful rescue. Keene made the decision that command positions required, the choice between what he wanted to do and what circumstances allowed. We proceed with the deliberate clearance operation. Get your teams mobilized and coordinate with Deputy Thorne on logistics. I want continuous communication and immediate notification if we discover anything that changes our assessment of the threat level. Ione Mercier had been standing quietly near the map table, studying the terrain features around the beacon location with the focused attention of someone running mental calculations about routes and hazards. She looked up as the briefing concluded, her expression carrying a concern that went beyond the immediate operational challenges. "Sheriff Keene, I need to show you something that might be relevant," Mercier said, pulling out her own topographic map marked with annotations in colored pencil. "When I reviewed the area around that beacon coordinate, I noticed something about the terrain that bothers me. That location sits at the intersection of 3 different drainage systems, which means it's a natural collection point for anyone moving through that part of the mountains. It's exactly where I would position an observation post if I wanted to monitor traffic through the area." Keene studied the map, seeing what Mercier had identified. The beacon's location wasn't random. It occupied a tactical position that offered visibility over multiple approach routes, while being difficult to access except through narrow corridors that could be easily monitored or defended. If someone had chosen that spot deliberately, it suggested a level of tactical thinking that went beyond simple harassment of searchers. "You're saying someone might be watching that location, waiting to see who responds to the beacon?" Keene asked, feeling the operation's parameters shift again as new possibilities emerged. Mercier nodded slowly. "I'm saying that if I wanted to study search and rescue response patterns, or if I wanted to select targets from among the people who came looking, that beacon location would give me perfect visibility to make those observations. Sheriff, we might be walking into a situation where someone is actively observing our response rather than simply having set passive traps." The distinction was crucial. Passive traps were dangerous but predictable. Once identified and mapped, they could be avoided or neutralized. An active adversary watching and potentially adjusting their tactics in real time created exponentially more complex threat dynamics. It meant they couldn't rely on standard procedures or predictable approaches, because someone might be learning from their actions and preparing counters. Agent Voss had been listening to this exchange with the quiet intensity of someone whose professional experience included situations where the difference between passive and active threats determined whether people went home or went to morgues. "Miss Mercier makes a valid tactical point," he said. "If we're dealing with an active observer, we need to approach this more like a tactical operation than a search and rescue. That means deception, multiple approach routes, and careful counter-surveillance to identify if anyone is watching the area." The operational briefing continued for another hour, as teams assembled and equipment was loaded for what had become a complex tactical operation, rather than a straightforward rescue attempt. Keene found himself coordinating with agencies and specialists he'd never worked with before: FBI tactical teams, explosive ordnance disposal technicians, state police aviation units, and Forest Service personnel who provided detailed knowledge of the terrain and access routes. By mid-morning, they were ready to move. The storm had exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind nearly 2 feet of fresh snow and temperatures that had dropped into the single digits. The helicopter reconnaissance flight launched first, equipped with thermal imaging equipment that might identify heat signatures indicating either Cortez's presence or someone else operating in the area. Keene watched the aircraft disappear into the mountain valleys, its rotor noise fading into the vast silence of the winter Cascades. The ground element moved out 30 minutes later, following a route that paralleled but didn't duplicate the path Keene's team had taken during the night. Agent Voss had insisted on this approach, arguing that if someone was watching, they would expect rescuers to follow the most direct route to the beacon. By taking a longer but less obvious approach, they reduced the likelihood of triggering additional traps, while potentially gaining the element of surprise if an active adversary was present. Keene led the ground element with Deputy Thorne and Ione Mercier, followed by the FBI tactical team and the explosive ordnance disposal specialist. They moved slowly, using metal detectors to sweep the route ahead while team members examined the snow for signs of disturbance or concealment. The pace was frustratingly slow, covering perhaps half a mile per hour. But Keene understood that speed was meaningless if it put people into hazards that could be avoided with patience. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio 2 hours into the movement, reporting findings that added new dimensions to an already complex situation. Ground element, this is Air 1. We've completed thermal scan of the primary search area. We're showing one strong heat signature at the beacon coordinates, consistent with either a human subject or an active heat source. But we're also picking up 3 additional thermal anomalies in positions surrounding the beacon location, forming what looks like an observation perimeter. Recommend extreme caution on approach. Keene felt his tactical assessment shift as he processed this information. If there were multiple heat signatures in a perimeter arrangement, they were either looking at additional victims who had been trapped in the area, or they were dealing with multiple individuals who had positioned themselves to observe or control access to the beacon location. Neither scenario matched the profile of a lone, disturbed individual setting random traps. Air 1, can you determine if those perimeter signatures are consistent with human subjects or equipment? Keene asked, needing more information before deciding how to proceed. The pilot consulted with his thermal imaging operator before responding. Negative, Sheriff. At this altitude and with current atmospheric conditions, we can't distinguish between a human signature and properly insulated equipment generating heat. The signatures are persistent and haven't moved during our observation period, which could indicate either stationary personnel or positioned devices. Agent Voss had moved up beside Keene, studying his tactical map while listening to the helicopter's report. Sheriff, this is starting to look less like a rescue situation and more like a deliberate tactical scenario. Someone has either positioned themselves to control access to that beacon location, or they've set up something designed to look like human presence to draw us in. Either way, we need to revise our approach. The next decision would determine how the rest of this operation unfolded. Keene could order a direct approach to the beacon location, accepting the risk of potential confrontation or additional traps in exchange for speed. Or he could implement an even more cautious strategy, using observation and reconnaissance to gather more information before committing personnel to close proximity with whatever was waiting at those thermal signatures. Before Keene could make that decision, Deputy Thorne's voice cut through on the radio with urgency that made everyone on the tactical net immediately alert. Sheriff, I've got fresh tracks here, and they're not from our previous movement. Someone's been through this area within the past few hours, and they were moving with purpose. Keene and the FBI team moved quickly to Thorne's position, finding what the deputy had discovered. The tracks were clear in the fresh snow, boot prints from someone wearing what appeared to be military-style cold-weather boots, moving in a straight line that suggested confidence and familiarity with the terrain. The tracks led directly toward the beacon location, but they showed none of the cautious, searching pattern that would characterize someone lost or in distress. These were the tracks of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. These were made after the storm stopped, Mercier observed, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. You can see where the snow has started to settle into them, but there's no wind drift yet. I'd estimate these are 3 to 4 hours old, made right around dawn. Agent Voss was already on his radio, coordinating with the helicopter for aerial observation of the track line. Air 1, we've got fresh tracks leading toward the beacon location from approximately 300 meters west of our position. Can you follow the back trail and identify where they originated? The helicopter swung wide, using its altitude advantage to trace the track line back through the forest. The pilot's report came back within minutes, and it transformed the operation's entire character. Ground element, those tracks originate from a structure approximately 1 kilometer west of your position. Appears to be a cabin or small building, definitely man-made. We're showing smoke from a chimney, which means the structure is occupied. Keene felt pieces of a picture coming together. though the complete image remained frustratingly unclear. Someone was living in a remote cabin in the Cascade Wilderness, and that someone had moved toward the beacon location shortly after dawn, leaving fresh tracks that suggested purpose rather than chance. The question was whether this person was Daniel Cortez, having somehow made it to shelter, or whether they were dealing with someone else entirely, possibly the individual responsible for the traps they'd discovered. "Agent Voss, I'm recommending we split our response," Keene said, making the tactical calculation that the situation now required. "Part of our element continues toward the beacon location to determine status of whoever or whatever is generating that primary heat signature. The other part investigates that cabin to identify who's living there and whether they're connected to this situation." Voss considered this proposal for perhaps 30 seconds before nodding agreement. "Concur. I'll take the primary team to the beacon location with your Deputy Thorne. You take a smaller element to investigate the cabin with Miss Mercier. We maintain radio contact, and nobody engages with anything or anyone without coordination. If this is an active adversary situation, we need to control the tactical development rather than letting circumstances force our decisions." The teams split, with Keene leading 3 officers and Mercier toward the cabin while Voss's larger element continued the deliberate movement toward the beacon. The cabin was exactly where the helicopter had indicated, a small structure built from logs and positioned in a clearing that provided good visibility over the surrounding terrain. Smoke rose from a metal chimney, and the building showed signs of regular maintenance. This wasn't an abandoned shelter, but someone's deliberate residence. Keene approached with tactical caution, using the tree line for concealment, while observing the cabin for signs of activity. The front door was closed, and there were no visible windows on the side facing their approach. Fresh tracks led from the cabin door toward the beacon location, confirming what the helicopter had reported. Someone had left this structure and moved with purpose toward the area where Cortez's beacon was transmitting. "Sheriff, look at this," Mercier whispered, pointing toward a structure behind the cabin that Keene had initially missed. It was a shed or storage building, and near its entrance were items that made Keene's law enforcement instincts suddenly heighten. Steel rebar cut to various lengths, shovels and other digging implements, and what appeared to be surveying equipment of the type used to mark trails or establish positions with precision. The implications were clear. Whoever lived in this cabin had the materials and tools to construct the trap they'd found, and the surveying equipment suggested they'd been marking or planning positions with careful deliberation. This wasn't a random hermit who'd built a defensive trap out of paranoia. This was someone conducting systematic work in these mountains, work that involved creating hazards and positioning them with tactical precision. Keene was about to call for additional backup when the cabin door opened and a figure emerged. The man was tall, perhaps 60 years old, wearing heavy winter clothing and carrying what appeared to be a thermos. He stopped when he saw the law enforcement presence, but his reaction wasn't panic or surprise. It was the careful, measured response of someone who had been expecting this confrontation eventually and had prepared for it mentally. "You'd be Sheriff Keene," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I figured someone would find their way up here eventually, especially after that hiker started transmitting his distress beacon. I'm assuming you've got questions about those traps I built." Keene kept his hand near his sidearm while maintaining a non-threatening posture, aware that this conversation could escalate in multiple directions depending on how the next few moments unfolded. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands visible and identify yourself. We are investigating a missing person case and we've discovered hazardous devices in this area. I need to know what your involvement is in this situation." The man set his thermos down carefully on the cabin's porch railing, keeping his movements slow and obvious. "My name is Walter Kendrick. I've lived in these mountains for 15 years, and I've been building those traps for the past 3 months. They're not designed to hurt hikers or people who belong up here. They're designed to stop the people who've been using these mountains for something that law enforcement should have been investigating years ago. Keene felt the situation shifting again, moving from what he'd assumed was a disturbed individual creating hazards into something that might involve local knowledge about criminal activity in the area. Mr. Kendrick, I need you to explain what you mean by people who don't belong up here, and why you felt the need to build traps instead of contacting law enforcement. Kendrick's laugh was bitter, carrying years of frustration. Sheriff, I contacted your department 4 times over the past 2 years, reporting suspicious activity in these mountains. People moving through at night, vehicles on the forest roads during seasons when there's no legitimate reason for traffic, and signs of organized activity in areas that should be empty except for occasional hikers. Every time I called, I was told you'd look into it, but nothing ever changed. So I decided if law enforcement wasn't going to protect these mountains, I would. Deputy Thorne's voice crackled over Keene's radio before he could respond to Kendrick's statement. Sheriff, you need to hear this. We've reached the beacon location and we've found Cortez. He's alive, but in bad condition, hypothermic and injured. But Sheriff, he's telling us something about the people who are holding him that you need to know about immediately. Keene kept his attention divided between Kendrick and the radio, gesturing for the man to remain where he was while he processed this new information. Go ahead, Deputy. Thorne's voice carried tension that Keene recognized as the strain of someone dealing with a situation that had just become significantly more complex. Cortez says he wasn't lost, Sheriff. He was taken. There's been a group operating in these mountains, using the remote access roads to move product. When Cortez stumbled onto their operation while hiking, they grabbed him and were holding him until they could decide what to do. He managed to escape this morning, activated his beacon, and was trying to make it out when the storm got too severe. The people who were holding him, he says there's at least 3 of them, and they're still in the area. The situation crystallized in Keene's mind with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. The traps, the occupied cabin, the suspicious activity Kendrick had been reporting, they were all connected to what was apparently an organized criminal operation using the Cascade Wilderness as their base. Kendrick hadn't been a disturbed individual creating random hazards. He'd been attempting to defend his territory against people who were using it for illegal purposes, and his traps had been aimed at stopping that criminal activity rather than harming innocent hikers or search and rescue personnel. Mr. Kendrick, Keene said carefully, I need you to tell me everything you know about the people operating in these mountains. And then I need you to tell me where you positioned those traps, because we have a missing persons case that just became a criminal investigation. And I need to know what my people are walking into. Kendrick's expression shifted from defensive to something approaching relief, as if he'd been waiting years for someone in authority to finally take his concerns seriously. Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you is going to explain why I built those traps, and why I was willing to face legal consequences to stop what's been happening in these mountains. But you need to understand something first. The people running this operation aren't just criminals. They're organized, they're connected, and they've been operating with impunity because they know how to use this terrain, and they've been confident that rural law enforcement doesn't have the resources to stop them. As Keene listened to Kendrick's account of what he'd observed over the past 2 years, he realized that what had started as a straightforward search and rescue operation had uncovered something far more significant and dangerous. The Cascade Wilderness that he'd sworn to protect was being used as a corridor and staging area for criminal activity on a scale that would require resources beyond what his department could provide. And the traps that had nearly killed his search team had been built not by a madman, but by a frustrated citizen who had watched his reports to law enforcement disappear into bureaucratic indifference. The radio traffic between his position and Deputy Thorne's location was increasing, with Agent Voss coordinating the extraction of Cortez while simultaneously positioning his tactical team to respond to the possibility of encountering the people who had held the hiker. Keene found himself managing multiple crisis situations simultaneously: the immediate need to secure Cortez's safety, the requirement to investigate Kendrick's allegations, and the tactical challenge of operating in terrain that might still be trapped or under observation by hostile forces. As morning moved toward afternoon, Keene stood in that mountain clearing and understood that the next decisions he made would determine whether this situation resolved with minimal casualties or escalated into something that would haunt everyone involved. The beacon was still transmitting somewhere in those mountains, but now Keene knew it marked not just a rescue site but the intersection of criminal activity, vigilante justice, and law enforcement response in terrain that offered perfect concealment for anyone willing to use violence to protect their operations. The extraction of Daniel Cortez took 3 hours and required resources that pushed the operational capacity of every agency involved to its absolute limit. Deputy Thorne coordinated with the helicopter crew to establish a landing zone in a clearing approximately half a mile from where they'd found the hiker, while Agent Voss's tactical team maintained security perimeter against the possibility that whoever had been holding Cortez might attempt to prevent his rescue or eliminate him as a witness. Keene remained at Kendrick's cabin, using the structure as a forward command post while simultaneously conducting an interview that was revealing the scope of criminal operations in the Cascade Wilderness. Walter Kendrick sat at his rough-hewn kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold between his weathered hands as he laid out 2 years of observations and documentation that law enforcement should have been investigating all along. The cabin's interior reflected 15 years of solitary mountain living, sparse but functional, with maps covering every available wall surface and notebooks stacked on shelves that documented weather patterns, wildlife movements, and increasingly, the activities of people who had no legitimate reason to be operating in this remote section of the Cascades. It started about 2 years ago, Kendrick explained, pulling down one of his notebooks and opening it to entries marked with dates and times. I began noticing vehicle traffic on Forest Road 9738 during hours when nobody should be up here. 3, 4 in the morning, I'd hear engines on the access roads. At first I thought it was poachers, or maybe Forest Service doing work I didn't know about. But the pattern was too regular, too organized. Same routes, same time frames, and always during new moon periods when visibility is lowest. Keene studied the notebook entries, seeing careful documentation of vehicle descriptions, dates, and observed patterns that demonstrated Kendrick wasn't a paranoid hermit, but rather someone with legitimate concerns about suspicious activity. You said you reported this to my department. Who did you speak with and what was their response? Kendrick's expression darkened with frustration that had clearly been building for months. First time was 18 months ago. I hiked down to the ranger station at Salmon-Lasac and had them relay a message to your office. Deputy named Franklin took the report, said someone would look into it. 3 months later, nothing had changed, so I called directly. Different deputy this time told me they'd increase patrols in the area. But Sheriff, I never saw increased patrols. I saw the same suspicious vehicles running the same patterns, getting bolder. The name Franklin triggered recognition in Keene's mind. Deputy James Franklin had retired 8 months earlier after 22 years with the department, taking his pension and moving to Arizona. Keene made a mental note to review Franklin's case files and determine whether those reports from Kendrick had been properly investigated or had disappeared into the kind of bureaucratic void that allowed criminal operations to flourish undetected. Tell me specifically what you observed about these vehicles and the people operating them, Keene said, pulling out his own notebook to document what might become crucial evidence in a criminal investigation that was expanding beyond the immediate crisis. Kendrick rose and moved to one of his wall maps, pointing to locations marked with colored pins that formed a pattern across the mountainous terrain. The vehicles always used this network of forest roads here, accessing areas that connect to the old mining claims from the 1920s. Most people don't know those claims exist because they're not maintained, and the access is difficult. But if you know the routes, you can move vehicles through this entire section of the Cascades without ever touching main highways where you might encounter law enforcement. The tactical advantage of such routes was immediately apparent to Keene. The forest road network in this area had been built decades earlier to support logging and mining operations, creating a web of rough but passable routes that connected isolated areas without depending on maintained highways. For criminal operations requiring discretion and mobility, these roads offered perfect infrastructure that avoided the checkpoints and surveillance associated with regular transportation corridors. What were they moving? Keene asked, though he was beginning to form suspicions about the nature of the operation based on the patterns Kendrick described. Never got close enough to see cargo directly, Kendrick admitted. But based on vehicle types and the way they moved, I'd say something valuable and illegal. The trucks were always covered, and they moved in pairs. One vehicle carrying whatever they were transporting, another riding security. Professional operation, Sheriff, not amateurs or opportunists. Keene's radio crackled with an update from Deputy Thorne at the helicopter landing zone. Sheriff, Cortez is loaded and the bird is lifting off. Medics say he's hypothermic and dehydrated but stable. He's conscious enough to provide information, and he's asking to speak with you directly as soon as possible. Says what he saw up here is bigger than just the people who grabbed him. Copy that, Keene replied. I'm wrapping up at this location and will coordinate with medical staff when we get back to town. What's Agent Voss's assessment of the security situation at the Beacon location? Thorne's response carried undertones of concern that matched Keene's own growing unease about what they'd uncovered. Agent Voss says the site shows signs of recent occupation by multiple individuals. They found evidence of observation posts and equipment caches that suggest this wasn't a temporary camp, but part of an established operation. He's recommending we treat the entire area as a crime scene and bring in additional resources for a comprehensive investigation. The implications were staggering in their scope. What had started as a search for a lost hiker had revealed organized criminal activity using public lands as operational territory. A vigilante resident who'd taken matters into his own hands after law enforcement failed to respond, and now evidence suggesting the criminal operation was sophisticated enough to maintain permanent infrastructure in remote wilderness areas. Keene understood that he was looking at something that would require resources far beyond what his rural county could provide, and political complications that would ripple through multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Mr. Kendrick, Keene said, making a decision that would determine how the next phase of this investigation unfolded. I need you to come back to town with me and provide a formal statement about everything you've observed. I also need to know the locations of every trap you built, because we're going to have people working in these mountains, and I can't risk someone triggering one of your devices. Kendrick nodded slowly, seeming to understand that his solitary campaign against the criminal operation was now being absorbed into an official investigation that would either validate his concerns or result in criminal charges for the hazards he'd created. Sheriff, I'll cooperate fully, but you need to understand something. The people running this operation know these mountains as well as I do, maybe better. They've had 2 years to establish themselves while law enforcement did nothing. Whatever response you're planning, they'll see it coming unless you approach this with more sophistication than routine patrol work. The warning was valid, and it highlighted the central challenge of investigating criminal operations in terrain that offered perfect concealment and observation advantages to anyone familiar with the landscape. Standard law enforcement tactics that worked in urban or suburban environments became liabilities in wilderness areas where criminals could watch approach routes from miles away and had unlimited escape options through terrain that defeated vehicle pursuit. Agent Voss arrived at Kendrick's cabin 90 minutes later. bringing with him a preliminary assessment of what his team had found at the beacon location that confirmed Kendrick's observations and expanded the investigation's scope even further. The FBI agent's expression carried the careful neutrality of someone who had worked enough complex cases to know that premature conclusions led to investigative dead ends. "Sheriff Keene, we've documented evidence of an organized operation at that beacon site that goes beyond simple criminal activity," Voss began, spreading photographs across Kendrick's table that showed equipment caches, observation positions, and infrastructure that demonstrated long-term planning. "We found communications equipment, supplies for extended operations, and most significantly, records that suggest this location was being used as a coordination point for activities across a much wider area than just this immediate section of the Cascades." Keene studied the photographs, seeing details that transformed his understanding of what they were investigating. The communications equipment wasn't the kind of consumer-grade radios that casual criminals might use. It was professional-grade gear capable of encrypted communications over distances that could coordinate activities across the entire region. The supplies included cold-weather gear, weapons, and operational materials that suggested people had been living and working at this location for extended periods. "What kind of records did you find?" Keene asked, focusing on what might provide investigative leads to identify the people involved in this operation. Voss pulled out evidence bags containing documents that had been photographed in place before collection. Logistics schedules, route maps, and what appeared to be financial records documenting transactions. "Everything's coded, but our analysis team should be able to decrypt enough to understand the scope of what's been moving through here. Based on the financial figures I can see, we're talking about an operation moving product worth millions of dollars through these mountains." The scale of the operation explained why it had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for 2 years. This wasn't opportunistic criminal activity, but rather organized logistics, using wilderness terrain as infrastructure for moving high-value contraband. The investment required to establish and maintain such an operation suggested involvement by criminal organizations with significant resources and professional expertise in evading law enforcement. Yoni Mercier had been examining the maps and photographs with the focused attention of someone who understood wilderness environments and how people moved through them. She looked up from the materials with an observation that added another layer of complexity to what they were investigating. "Sheriff, look at these route maps," Mercier said, pointing to specific features marked on the documents Voss had recovered. "These aren't just transportation corridors. They're showing cache locations, observation posts, and what look like alternate routes marked for different weather conditions and threat levels. Whoever planned this operation has been conducting professional reconnaissance and establishing infrastructure that would let them operate year-round regardless of conditions. The sophistication suggested military or paramilitary experience, the kind of operational planning that came from training rather than improvisation." Keene found himself revising his mental picture of who they were investigating, moving from assumptions about typical criminal organizations to something that might involve individuals with specialized backgrounds in tactics and logistics. "Agent Voss, based on what you've found, what's your assessment of who we're dealing with here?" Keene asked, needing federal expertise to understand the profile of adversaries who could establish and maintain this level of operation. Voss had clearly been forming his own assessment while examining the evidence. The operational sophistication suggests involvement by people with military or intelligence backgrounds. The logistics planning, the communications security, the tactical positioning of observation posts. These aren't skills that typical criminal organizations possess. We might be looking at individuals who've taken specialized training and applied it to criminal operations, or possibly a group with connections to organized networks that employ former military personnel. The implications were sobering. Rural law enforcement agencies were equipped and trained to handle typical criminal activity: domestic violence, theft, drug possession, occasional violence. They weren't designed to confront organized criminal operations run by people with military training and professional logistics expertise. The resources required to investigate and dismantle such an operation would stretch beyond what Kittitas County could provide, requiring federal involvement and coordination across multiple agencies. Keen's phone buzzed with a call from the hospital where Daniel Cortez had been transported. The emergency room physician's voice carried the professional calm of someone accustomed to delivering information under stressful circumstances, but Keen could detect underlying concern about what Cortez had been reporting to medical staff. "Sheriff Keen, this is Dr. Margaret Holloway at Kittitas Valley Hospital. Daniel Cortez is stable and his physical condition is improving, but he's been telling the nursing staff about his experience in the mountains that raises serious concerns. He's insistent about speaking with you directly and providing information he says is time-sensitive. I'm clearing him for an interview if you can come to the hospital." "I'll be there within the hour," Keen replied, recognizing that Cortez's testimony would be crucial for understanding what had been happening in the mountains and identifying the people involved in the operation. "Make sure he understands that anything he tells me may need to be repeated in formal legal proceedings, and document his condition for the record." The drive back to Cle Elum took 40 minutes, with Keen using the time to coordinate with state police and federal agencies about resource allocation for what was becoming a multi-jurisdictional investigation. Agent Voss had committed FBI resources for evidence analysis and tactical support, while the state police were providing additional personnel for site security and investigative assistance. The Forest Service was coordinating closure of the affected areas to prevent civilian access while operations continued. Walter Kendrick rode in the passenger seat, staring out at the mountain landscape he'd called home for 15 years with an expression that suggested complicated feelings about what his reports had finally triggered. Keen understood that Kendrick faced potential criminal charges for building traps on public lands, but he also recognized that the man had been trying to address a legitimate threat that law enforcement had failed to investigate properly. "Mr. Kendrick, I can't make promises about how the legal system will treat what you did up there," Keen said as they drove through the snow-covered valleys. "But I can tell you that your documentation and observations are going to be crucial evidence in this investigation. The traps you built put people at risk, including my own personnel, but your reports about suspicious activity were legitimate concerns that should have been taken seriously." Kendrick nodded slowly, seeming to understand that he'd crossed legal lines even if his motivations had been understandable. "Sheriff, I'm not looking for immunity or special treatment. I did what I felt I had to do when law enforcement didn't respond, but if my information helps you shut down whatever those people were doing in the mountains, then maybe my choices will count for something beyond just vigilante stupidity." The interview with Daniel Cortez took place in a private room at the hospital, with medical staff monitoring the hiker's condition while Keen documented testimony that would form the foundation of the criminal investigation. Cortez was a software engineer from Seattle who had been hiking the Cascades for years, familiar with the terrain and experienced enough to handle solo overnight trips in challenging conditions. What he described about his encounter with the criminal operation provided crucial details about their methods and the nature of what they were moving through the mountains. "I was hiking toward my planned camping spot at Iron Creek when I saw vehicle lights on what should have been an abandoned forest road," Cortez began, his voice still carrying the exhaustion of his ordeal but strengthening as he committed to providing information. "It was about 8 p.m., full dark, and those roads shouldn't have any traffic at that hour. I got curious and moved closer to see what was happening, thinking maybe it was Forest Service doing maintenance or something legitimate." Keen recorded this on video while taking notes, aware that Cortez's testimony would need to withstand legal scrutiny if this investigation led to prosecutions. "What did you see when you got closer to the vehicles?" Cortez's expression darkened with remembered fear. Two trucks, both newer models, moving without headlights once they were off the main forest road. They were using night vision equipment. I could see the infrared illuminators. Professional gear, Sheriff, not the kind of stuff recreational users have. The vehicles stopped at what looked like a predetermined location, and people got out to unload cargo. I couldn't see exactly what they were moving, but the way they handled it suggested it was valuable and heavy. "How many people did you see?" "At least 4, maybe 5. They were working with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this many times before. No conversation that I could hear, just hand signals and coordinated movement. I knew immediately I was watching something illegal, and I started backing away as quietly as I could. That's when one of them spotted me." Keene felt the interview's importance intensifying as Cortez described the crucial moment when observation became confrontation. "What happened when they spotted you?" Cortez's hand trembled slightly as he recalled the experience. "They didn't shout or act surprised. One of them just pointed in my direction and 3 others moved to intercept me. I tried to run, but they knew the terrain, and they had night vision while I was using a headlamp. They caught me within maybe 200 yards, zip-tied my hands, and took me back to their vehicles. Sheriff, the whole thing was executed like a military operation. Precise, efficient, no wasted motion." "Did they identify themselves or explain what they were doing?" "Not directly, but I heard them talking to each other, discussing what to do with me. One of them was in charge, an older guy, maybe 50s, with the kind of voice that expects to be obeyed. He made the decision to hold me while they figured out whether I'd reported seeing them or if anyone knew where I was. They took my phone, my GPS, everything electronic, and moved me to a different location where they had what looked like a permanent camp set up. The description of a permanent camp confirmed what Agent Voss's team had found at the beacon location, suggesting the criminal operation had established multiple sites for different purposes throughout the mountains. Keene needed details about these locations to coordinate search operations and build a comprehensive understanding of the operation's infrastructure. "Can you describe the camp where they held you and provide any details that might help us locate it?" Cortez closed his eyes, clearly working to recall details through the trauma and exhaustion. It was in a canyon or drainage area, protected from weather and hidden from casual observation. They had tents, communications equipment, supplies for extended operations. The site had been there for a while, established paths, organized equipment storage, even a latrine area. This wasn't a temporary camp, Sheriff. These people had been living and working there for months, maybe longer. How many people were at this camp? I saw 3 regularly, but there were references to others who were working different shifts or positions. They talked about north sector and south routes, like they had people covering multiple areas. Based on their communications, I'd estimate they had at least 8 to 10 people involved in the overall operation. The scale continued to expand with each piece of information. 10 people conducting organized operations across multiple locations required coordination, funding, and logistics that placed this far beyond typical criminal activity. Keene was looking at something that approached paramilitary operations, using public lands as operational territory while law enforcement remained completely unaware of their presence. "What happened that allowed you to escape?" Keene asked, needing to understand how Cortez had managed to get away from people who had demonstrated professional competence in controlling him. "The storm," Cortez replied. "When it hit yesterday, they moved most of their personnel to weather-protected locations and left only 2 people watching me. The storm got severe enough that visibility was nearly 0, and I managed to work my restraints loose. I waited until the guards were dealing with wind damage to their tent. Then I just ran into the storm." They tried to follow, but the conditions were too severe for them to track me effectively. I activated my personal locator beacon once I'd put some distance between us, then tried to find shelter. Did you hear anything about what they were transporting or why they were using these mountains? Cortez nodded emphatically. They talked about product and delivery schedules, but never specified what exactly they were moving. Based on the security measures and the way they discussed it, I'd say drugs or possibly weapons. The financial figures they mentioned were in the hundreds of thousands per run, which puts this in the category of major criminal enterprise rather than small-time smuggling. The interview continued for another hour, with Cortez providing details about the people who had held him, their equipment, their methods, and overheard conversations that would help investigators understand the operation's structure. By the time Keene concluded the formal interview, he had documentation that would justify federal intervention and resource allocation for a comprehensive investigation that might take months to complete. As Keene left the hospital, his phone was already ringing with calls from state and federal agencies wanting updates on the investigation. The media had begun reporting that a search and rescue operation in the Cascades had uncovered evidence of criminal activity, which meant public attention and political pressure would soon compound the operational challenges of investigating a sophisticated criminal organization operating in terrain that offered every tactical advantage to people willing to use violence to protect their interests. Deputy Thorne met Keene at the Sheriff's Department with updates that confirmed the investigation was expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. Sheriff, Agent Voss has coordinated with federal prosecutors and they're pursuing warrants for electronic surveillance of known criminal organizations that might be involved in operations like what we found in the mountains. State police have established checkpoints on forest roads leading into the affected area, and Forest Service has implemented emergency closures to prevent civilian access. Keene felt the weight of command decisions that would determine how this investigation proceeded. What's our resource status for supporting this operation? I need to know what we can sustain and what we need to request from external agencies. Thorne consulted his notes, providing the kind of detailed logistical assessment that made him invaluable during complex operations. We can maintain current staffing levels for about 72 hours before overtime costs become prohibitive. After that, we'll need state or federal assistance to sustain operations. The FBI has committed resources for the duration, but they're requesting local liaison and support for navigating the social and political landscape. The phrase, social and political landscape, was a careful euphemism for the reality that investigating criminal operations in rural areas often involved confronting uncomfortable questions about why those operations had been able to establish themselves without detection. Keene knew that his department's failure to investigate Walter Kendrick's reports would become a focus of scrutiny, and that examining why those reports had been ignored might reveal either incompetence or something more troubling like corruption or complicity. I want a complete review of every report filed about suspicious activity in the Cascade Wilderness over the past 3 years, Keene said, making the decision to address potential departmental failures directly, rather than waiting for external investigators to uncover them. If there's a pattern of ignored reports or inadequate follow-up, I need to know about it before someone else finds it and uses it to question our credibility. As evening approached, Keene found himself in his office reviewing the expanding case file and trying to understand how criminal operations of this sophistication had been able to establish themselves in his county without triggering any significant law enforcement response. The answer, he suspected, involved a combination of factors: the vast terrain that made comprehensive surveillance impossible, limited resources for investigating reports in remote areas, and possibly the kind of bureaucratic indifference that allowed concerning reports to disappear without proper investigation. But there was another possibility that Keene couldn't ignore, one that made him deeply uncomfortable but demanded consideration. If the criminal operation had been running for 2 years despite multiple reports, it suggested they might have had assistance or at minimum tolerance from someone within the system who could ensure that investigations didn't proceed. The mention of Deputy Franklin, who had taken Kendrick's initial reports and then retired shortly before this situation came to light, raised questions that would need careful investigation. The secure phone on Keene's desk rang with a call from Agent Voss, who had returned to the mountain sites with additional evidence response teams. The FBI agent's voice carried the careful control of someone delivering information that would complicate an already complex situation. Sheriff Keene, our analysis of the documents recovered from the Beacon site has revealed something you need to know about immediately, Voss said without preamble. We've identified references to law enforcement personnel in these records, suggesting the criminal organization has been monitoring or possibly receiving information about police activities in the region. I'm not making accusations, but we need to treat this investigation as potentially compromised by internal sources. Keene felt something cold settle in his stomach as he absorbed the implications. Are you saying we have corruption within my department? I'm saying the documents reference friendly contacts and advance notice in contexts that suggest someone has been providing the organization with intelligence about law enforcement activities. Could be someone in your department, could be state police, could be any agency with access to operational information. Until we identify the source, we need to assume that operational security is compromised and plan accordingly. The revelation transformed the investigation's parameters yet again. They were no longer just investigating a criminal organization, but also hunting for potential corruption within law enforcement that had enabled that organization to operate with impunity. The political and professional ramifications would be severe, but Keene understood that addressing corruption was non-negotiable regardless of the consequences. Agent Voss, I want a complete internal review of my department's handling of reports related to this case, Keene said. If there's corruption or complicity, I'll expose it myself rather than have it discovered by external investigators. But I need your help to do this quietly enough that we don't tip off anyone who might be involved. As night settled over the Cascades, Keene stood at his office window looking toward the mountain peaks that had seemed so familiar until today. Somewhere in that darkness, a criminal organization was probably regrouping after having one of their operations exposed, evaluating what law enforcement knew and planning their response. And somewhere, possibly within his own department, someone might be providing them with information that would determine whether the investigation succeeded or failed. The beacon had stopped transmitting hours ago. Its purpose served. But the signal it had sent would continue reverberating through law enforcement agencies, criminal organizations, and the political structures of rural Washington, as everyone involved tried to understand what had been uncovered in the Cascade Wilderness and what it meant for their futures. The investigation consumed the next 72 hours with the relentless momentum of something that had been building pressure for years and finally found release. Sheriff Keene operated on minimal sleep and maximum coffee, coordinating between federal agencies whose bureaucratic procedures often conflicted with the urgent timeline of pursuing an organized criminal operation that might be preparing to abandon their infrastructure or eliminate evidence. The conference room at the Catitas County Sheriff's Department had been transformed into a joint operations center, with representatives from the FBI, DEA, state police, and Forest Service law enforcement crowding around tables covered with maps, photographs, and organizational charts that grew more complex with each day's discoveries. Agent Voss had brought in a forensic accountant from the FBI's Seattle field office, a precise woman named Catherine Drummond, who approached financial records with the focused intensity of someone reading enemy battle plans. She'd spent 48 hours analyzing the documents recovered from the mountain sites, cross-referencing coded entries with known criminal organizations and building a picture of financial flows that stunned even experienced investigators. Sheriff Keene, we're looking at an operation that's moved approximately $18 million through these mountains over the past 2 years, Drummond announced during the morning briefing on the third day of intensive investigation. The financial structure is sophisticated. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency conversions. But the underlying pattern suggests we're dealing with drug trafficking, specifically high-grade synthetic opioids moving from Canadian sources to distribution networks in the Pacific Northwest. Keene absorbed this information while studying the financial flowcharts Drummond had constructed. $18 million represented a scale of criminal enterprise that dwarfed anything his county had encountered in his entire career. The numbers explained the professional sophistication of the operation, the military-grade equipment, and the willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened their logistics network. "Do we have identification on who's running this operation?" Keene asked, focusing on the question that would determine whether arrests could be made or whether the investigation would stall in documentation of crimes without suspects. Voss stepped forward with photographs that had been extracted from surveillance equipment found at the mountain sites. "We've identified 3 primary individuals who appear to be managing the operational level activities. The one Cortez described as being in charge is Marcus Ballard, former Army logistics specialist dishonorably discharged 8 years ago for involvement in black market activities in Afghanistan. He's been linked to several criminal organizations in the Pacific Northwest, but has avoided prosecution through careful distance from direct operations." The photograph showed a man in his early 50s with the weathered appearance of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, but with eyes that suggested calculation rather than wilderness appreciation. Keene studied the image, committing features to memory while Voss continued the briefing. "The other 2 we've identified are Thomas Wickham and Raymond Portis, both with military backgrounds, both with records of involvement in criminal enterprises after leaving service. They appear to be Ballard's lieutenants, managing field operations while he coordinates logistics and maintains connections with higher-level criminal organizations." Deputy Thorne had been working with state police to map the broader network of forest roads and access points that the criminal operation had been using. He'd identified a pattern that suggested the organization had been gradually expanding their operational territory over the 2 years they'd been active, moving from initial routes in the immediate Cascade area to a network that now extended across multiple counties and touched 3 different national forests. "Sheriff, look at this progression," Thorne said, displaying a series of maps that showed the operation's expansion over time. They started with a single route corridor, tested it for several months, then gradually expanded once they were confident they could operate without detection. By 6 months ago, they were running multiple routes simultaneously and had established permanent infrastructure at key locations. This wasn't opportunistic crime. This was systematic territorial expansion. The pattern suggested long-term planning and investment, which raised troubling questions about why such expansion had been possible without triggering any coordinated law enforcement response. Keene knew that part of the answer lay in the fragmented nature of rural law enforcement, where county boundaries, state and federal jurisdiction, and limited resources created gaps that sophisticated criminals could exploit. But he also knew that the references to friendly contacts in the documents Voss had recovered suggested active assistance rather than just passive exploitation of systemic weaknesses. The internal investigation that Keene had ordered was being conducted by a state police internal affairs specialist named Margaret Hollis, a veteran investigator whose reputation for thoroughness made her both respected and feared within law enforcement circles. She'd been reviewing departmental records for 3 days, and the preliminary report she delivered that afternoon confirmed Keene's concerns while raising additional questions about how deeply corruption might have penetrated his department. Sheriff Keene, I've completed initial review of reports filed regarding suspicious activity in the Cascade Wilderness over the past 3 years, Hollis began, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering findings that would have professional consequences. I've identified 11 separate reports that describe activity consistent with what we now know was the criminal organization's operations. Of those 11 reports, 8 were taken by Deputy James Franklin during the period before his retirement, and none of them received follow-up investigation beyond initial documentation. Keene felt anger building as he absorbed this information, but he kept his voice level when he responded. What's your assessment of whether this pattern represents incompetence or deliberate suppression of investigation? Hollis didn't hesitate. The pattern is too consistent to be explained by incompetence alone. Franklin had access to investigative resources and supervisory oversight that should have resulted in at least preliminary investigation of multiple reports describing similar activity. The fact that no action was taken on any of these reports suggests either explicit corruption or a level of negligence that approaches criminal disregard for duty. The implications were devastating both professionally and personally. James Franklin had been a respected member of the department, someone Keene had trusted to handle investigations competently. If Franklin had been actively protecting the criminal organization in exchange for payments or other benefits, it meant that corruption had operated at the supervisory level while Keene remained completely unaware. Can we establish direct connection between Franklin and the criminal organization? Keene asked, needing evidence that would support criminal charges rather than just administrative findings. Not yet, Hollis admitted. Franklin's financial records don't show obvious deposits or transactions that would indicate payments from criminal sources, but we've identified several periods where he took personal time that coincides with major movements indicated in the organization's logistics schedules. It's circumstantial, but it suggests coordination between his availability and their operations. Agent Voss had been reviewing the same information through federal investigative channels, and he added context that made the situation even more troubling. Sheriff, we've also identified that Franklin maintained contact with Marcus Ballard through intermediaries. They didn't communicate directly, but we've traced a network of connections through third parties that allowed information to flow between them. This level of operational security suggests both parties knew they needed to avoid leaving direct evidence of collaboration. The investigation was revealing layers of criminality that extended beyond the obvious drug trafficking to include corruption of law enforcement, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to operate a continuing criminal enterprise. The legal complexity meant that prosecution would require months or even years of additional investigation, but Keene understood that they had enough evidence now to begin making arrests and disrupting the organization's ability to continue operations. What's our tactical plan for apprehending Ballard and his lieutenants? Keene asked, shifting focus from investigation to operational execution. These people have demonstrated they're willing to use violence, and they've had military training. Any arrest attempt needs to assume they'll resist. Voss had been coordinating with FBI tactical teams about precisely this question. We've identified probable locations for all 3 primary targets. Ballard maintains a residence in Yakima under a false identity, while Wickham and Portis have been operating out of a property near Ellensburg that was purchased through one of their shell companies. We're planning coordinated raids at 0600 tomorrow morning, using federal tactical teams supported by state police and your department. The timeline was aggressive, but Keene understood the reasoning. Every hour the investigation continued gave the criminal organization more time to destroy evidence, relocate resources, or eliminate witnesses. Speed would be essential, but it also increased risks if the tactical plans encountered unexpected complications. Guillaume Mercier had been serving as a consultant on the investigation, providing expertise about the mountain terrain and helping identify locations where the criminal organization might have additional facilities or cache sites. She'd been reviewing aerial reconnaissance photographs when she made a discovery that would complicate the tactical planning. "Sheriff Keene, I need to show you something," Mercier said, pulling up a series of images on her laptop. "These aerial photos show the property near Ellensburg where Wickham and Portis are supposedly living. Look at the terrain features around it. Multiple observation positions, cleared fields of fire, and what appear to be defensive positions. This property wasn't selected randomly. It was chosen specifically because it's defensible against law enforcement assault." Keene studied the photographs, seeing what Mercier had identified. The property occupied elevated ground with good visibility over approach routes, and the surrounding terrain had been subtly modified to create advantages for defenders while complicating access for anyone attempting to serve warrants or conduct raids. This level of preparation suggested the organization had anticipated eventual law enforcement response and had prepared accordingly. "Agent Voss, based on this information, what's your revised assessment of the tactical approach?" Keene asked, recognizing that the planned raids might need significant revision. Voss consulted with his tactical coordinator, then delivered an assessment that reflected the increased complexity. "We're going to need additional resources and more deliberate planning. A conventional raid on a fortified position risks casualties on both sides. I'm recommending we shift to a surveillance and isolation strategy. Surround the property, cut off escape routes, then negotiate surrender rather than forcing an assault." The revised strategy would take longer, but reduced risks of the kind of violent confrontation that could result in deaths on both sides. Keene approved the change, understanding that patience in tactical execution often produced better outcomes than aggressive action that created unnecessary casualties. The next 36 hours proceeded with the careful choreography of multiple law enforcement agencies coordinating complex operations across a wide geographic area. Surveillance teams positioned themselves around the Ellensburg property and Ballard's Yakima residence, documenting movements and establishing patterns. State police established checkpoints on roads leading into the Cascade Wilderness areas where the organization had infrastructure, preventing access while evidence response teams worked to document and dismantle the criminal facilities. Walter Kendrick had been cooperating fully with investigators, providing detailed information about his observations over 2 years and helping identify locations where the organization might have additional facilities. He'd been charged with misdemeanor offenses related to building unauthorized traps on public lands, but prosecutors had indicated that cooperation with the investigation would be considered favorably in any plea negotiations. "Sheriff, I know what I did was wrong," Kendrick said during one of their interviews at the department. "But watching those people operate for 2 years while law enforcement did nothing, it felt like someone had to do something. I'm not trying to justify the traps, but I want you to understand why I felt I had no other options." Keene understood the frustration that had driven Kendrick to take illegal action, even while recognizing that vigilante justice created more problems than it solved. "Mr. Kendrick, your observations and documentation are crucial to this investigation. That counts for something, even though the methods you chose put people at risk. The legal system will have to determine how to balance those factors." The raids were executed simultaneously at 0557 hours on a cold November morning, 6 days after the initial search for Daniel Cortez had uncovered the criminal operation. FBI tactical teams approached the Ellensburg property with careful coordination, establishing perimeter positions before announcing their presence and demanding surrender. The operation proceeded with tense professionalism, each phase executed according to carefully rehearsed plans, while negotiators maintained communication with the occupants. Thomas Wickham and Raymond Portis surrendered after 45 minutes of negotiation, emerging from the fortified property with their hands visible and following exact instructions from tactical commanders. Both men were experienced enough to recognize when resistance would be futile and professional enough to understand that cooperation at this stage might provide advantages in eventual legal proceedings. Marcus Ballard's arrest in Yakima proceeded less smoothly. When tactical teams approached his residence, they found the property abandoned with evidence that Ballard had departed hastily sometime during the previous night. The discovery suggested that despite operational security measures, information about the planned raids had reached the organization through sources that investigators hadn't identified. The leak meant that Ballard was now a fugitive with resources and connections that could allow him to remain free indefinitely. We've got 2 out of 3, but Ballard is the key to prosecuting the higher-level connections, Agent Voss told Keene during the post-operation briefing. Without him, we can charge Wickham and Portis with field operations, but we can't reach the organizational leadership that's been financing and directing this enterprise. The investigation continued with renewed urgency to locate Ballard before he could leave the region or destroy additional evidence. Financial monitoring detected activity on accounts associated with his known aliases, suggesting he was liquidating resources in preparation for extended flight. Border authorities were notified. Airports and transit hubs received bulletins, and a federal warrant was issued charging Ballard with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and corruption of public officials. Deputy Thorne had been analyzing the timeline of Ballard's flight, trying to determine how he'd been warned about the impending raids. Sheriff, the property shows signs of departure approximately 8 hours before the tactical teams moved in. That means someone with knowledge of our operational planning provided advance notice. We still have a leak somewhere in the system. The realization that the investigation remained compromised even after extensive security measures cast a shadow over the operational successes they'd achieved. Keene convened a meeting with only the most senior investigators, Agent Voss, Margaret Hollis from State Police Internal Affairs, and Deputy Thorne, to address the security breach. We've been operating under the assumption that James Franklin was our only internal problem, Keene began. But Ballard's escape suggests either Franklin had accomplices who are still active, or there's a separate source providing information to the organization. We need to identify that source before they can do more damage. Hollis had been conducting her own quiet investigation of communication patterns within the multi-agency task force. I've been monitoring information flow through the investigation, tracking who had access to operational details and when. The timing of Ballard's departure suggests someone with knowledge of the raid planning provided warning at least 12 hours in advance. That narrows our suspect pool considerably. The counterintelligence investigation that followed was conducted with paranoid attention to security, limiting information access to only those personnel whose involvement was absolutely necessary. Phone records were analyzed, email communications reviewed, and subtle inconsistencies in reporting were examined for signs of deliberate information leakage. The process was slow and methodical, but it eventually identified a pattern that pointed toward a specific individual. 3 days after the raids, Hollis delivered findings that would result in criminal charges against a second law enforcement officer. Sheriff Keene, we've identified that Sergeant David Morton with the state police has been in communication with individuals connected to Ballard's organization. The communications were indirect and carefully concealed, but they establish a pattern of information sharing that coincides with critical operational decisions. Morton was a 20-year veteran with the state police, someone who had been assigned to the task force specifically because of his experience with organized crime investigations. The revelation that he'd been compromised represented a devastating breach of trust that would have repercussions throughout the investigation and beyond. The arrest of Morton was conducted quietly to avoid alerting anyone else who might be providing information to the criminal organization. He was taken into custody at his home during off-duty hours, charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and corruption of public officials. His cooperation with investigators would be essential for understanding how deeply the criminal organization had penetrated law enforcement, and whether additional compromised personnel remained undiscovered. With Morton in custody and Wickham and Portis cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, the investigation began producing evidence that extended beyond the Cascade Wilderness operation to reveal connections with larger criminal networks operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. The organization had been part of a regional distribution system moving synthetic opioids from Canadian sources through multiple corridors, with the Cascade routes representing just one component of a much larger enterprise. Federal prosecutors built cases that would ultimately result in dozens of indictments across 3 states, dismantling networks that had been operating for years. But Marcus Ballard remained at large, and his continued freedom represented both a personal failure for Keene and an ongoing threat that the organization might attempt to rebuild operations once law enforcement attention moved to other priorities. 6 weeks after the initial discovery in the mountains, Keene stood once again in his office looking toward the Cascade Peaks where this investigation had begun. The criminal infrastructure in the wilderness had been dismantled, the corrupt law enforcement officers identified and prosecuted, and the distribution networks disrupted. But Ballard's escape meant the victory was incomplete, and the knowledge that corruption had operated within his own department left scars that would take years to heal. Daniel Cortez had returned to Seattle, his testimony preserved in depositions that would be crucial for prosecution, but his ordeal leaving psychological effects that would require ongoing treatment. Walter Kendrick had pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges and received probation in recognition of his cooperation, returning to his mountain cabin with a complicated legacy as both vigilante and key witness. Ione Mercier had continued her volunteer work with search and rescue, her expertise more valuable than ever in a county that now understood how criminal operations could exploit wilderness terrain. Deputy Thorne entered Keene's office with a report that had just arrived from federal marshals tracking Ballard. "Sheriff, there's been a possible sighting in British Columbia. Nothing confirmed, but the description matches and the timeline fits with his resources for crossing the border illegally." Keene studied the report, knowing that Ballard's presence in Canada would complicate extradition and might mean he'd remain free indefinitely despite the evidence against him. Forward everything to the Canadian authorities and maintain coordination with federal marshals. He'll surface eventually. People like Ballard can't stay hidden forever without the infrastructure he's lost. As evening approached and the office emptied of personnel ending their shifts, Keene remained at his desk reviewing files that documented everything learned during 6 weeks of intensive investigation. The operation had exposed vulnerabilities in rural law enforcement that criminals had exploited with devastating effectiveness. It had revealed corruption that had operated undetected, while good officers assumed their colleagues shared their commitment to the law. And it had demonstrated that wilderness areas, which seemed empty and peaceful to casual observers, could conceal criminal enterprises operating with sophistication that matched any urban organization. The final report Keene wrote for the county commissioners was necessarily incomplete. Ballard remained at large. The full extent of the criminal network's activities was still being investigated, and the psychological impact on a small department that had discovered corruption within its ranks would take years to fully understand. But certain conclusions were inescapable, and Keene documented them with painful honesty. The criminal organization operated successfully for 2 years because they understood that rural law enforcement faces challenges of scale and resources that urban agencies don't encounter. They exploited terrain that provides perfect concealment and countless escape routes. They corrupted personnel who had access to operational information and could ensure investigations never proceeded. And they built infrastructure in areas where the absence of regular law enforcement presence meant they could operate with near impunity. The recommendations that followed called for enhanced interagency coordination, improved systems for tracking reports across jurisdictional boundaries, and regular internal security reviews to identify potential corruption before it could become established. Implementation would require resources that counties like Catitas could barely afford, but the alternative was accepting that criminal organizations would continue exploiting the vulnerabilities that had allowed this operation to flourish. 3 months after the investigation concluded its active phase, Keene received a phone call from Royal Canadian Mounted Police that Marcus Ballard had been located in a remote area of British Columbia and was being processed for extradition on the federal warrants. The arrest had resulted from tip information that Ballard had been attempting to establish new operations in Canadian territory, suggesting he'd learned nothing from his exposure and was simply relocating rather than abandoning criminal enterprise. The news brought satisfaction, but not celebration. Ballard's extradition would allow prosecution of the highest level charges and might produce testimony about connections to larger criminal organizations. But it couldn't undo the damage his operation had caused. The lives disrupted by the drugs moved through cascade routes, the corruption that had infected law enforcement, or the death of public trust that occurred when communities discovered their police departments had been compromised. Deputy Thorne organized a small gathering at a local restaurant when Ballard's extradition was finalized, inviting the key personnel who had worked the investigation. It was an informal affair, deliberately low-key to avoid the appearance of celebration when so much damage had been done. Keene attended out of obligation, finding himself uncomfortable with recognition for investigating crimes that had operated undetected in his jurisdiction for years. Yona Mercier approached him during the gathering, her expression carrying the kind of understanding that came from someone who'd seen how investigations affected the people who conducted them. "Sheriff Keene, you're being too hard on yourself. You can't predict corruption or prevent every crime. What matters is that you didn't look away once you understood what was happening, and you didn't protect the department at the expense of truth." Keene appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't fully accept it. Ms. Mercier, an organized criminal operation moved $18 million in drugs through my county while I remained completely unaware. Walter Kendrick filed multiple reports that were ignored by personnel under my supervision. Those aren't minor oversights. They're systematic failures that allowed serious crimes to continue. They're also realities of rural law enforcement that every sheriff in the state faces, Mercier countered. Limited resources, vast territory, and criminals who are sophisticated enough to exploit those limitations. You can't be everywhere, and you can't know everything. What you can do is respond effectively when crimes are discovered, which is exactly what you did. The conversation continued, but Keene knew that his feelings about the investigation would take longer to resolve than a single discussion could address. Command positions carried responsibilities that extended beyond tactical decisions to include accepting accountability for failures that occurred under your authority, even when those failures involved personnel who had deliberately concealed their crimes. The trial of Thomas Wickham and Raymond Portis proceeded through federal court over the following year, resulting in convictions on multiple charges and sentences that would keep both men in federal prison for decades. Their cooperation had provided evidence about the organization's operations and connections that proved valuable for prosecuting related cases, but both men declined to provide testimony that would directly implicate higher-level criminal figures beyond Ballard. James Franklin, the retired deputy whose corruption had enabled the organization to operate without law enforcement interference, pleaded guilty to charges of obstruction of justice and received a prison sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and his advanced age. His cooperation had been minimal, suggesting either fear of retaliation or continued loyalty to criminal associates. Sergeant David Morton of the state police fought his charges through trial, arguing that his communications with criminal associates had been part of an unauthorized undercover operation rather than corruption. The jury rejected this defense after 3 days of deliberation, convicting him on all charges and resulting in a sentence that ended his law enforcement career and his freedom for the foreseeable future. Marcus Ballard's trial became the centerpiece of the federal prosecution, drawing media attention and public interest because of the scope of the criminal enterprise and the corruption of law enforcement that had enabled it. Ballard maintained his innocence through trial, arguing that the evidence against him had been obtained improperly and that he'd been targeted because of his previous military service rather than any actual criminal conduct. The jury deliberated for 5 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Ballard was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 50s. The judge's statement at sentencing reflected the severity of the crimes and the betrayal of public trust that corruption represented. Mr. Ballard, you took skills and training provided by the United States military and used them to construct a criminal enterprise that moved poison through communities and corrupted the very law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect citizens. Your actions represent not just violation of law, but betrayal of every principle that military service should instill. This court hopes your sentence serves as deterrent to others who might consider similar paths. Keene attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the public gallery and watching as Ballard was led away in chains to begin serving his sentence. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only the heavy knowledge that justice was being served, but couldn't undo the damage that had been done during the 2 years the organization had operated freely. The years that followed brought changes to Catitas County law enforcement that reflected lessons learned during the investigation. The department implemented enhanced training for recognizing and reporting suspicious activity in remote areas. Communication protocols with federal and state agencies were improved to ensure that reports about organized criminal activity received appropriate follow-up, and internal security reviews became regular practice, designed to identify potential corruption before it could become established and protected. Walter Kendrick remained in his mountain cabin, his vigilante actions having ultimately contributed to exposing the criminal operation even as they violated the law. He maintained occasional contact with Keene, providing reports about conditions in the Cascade Wilderness that were now taken seriously and investigated appropriately. The traps he'd built had been completely removed, and the areas where they'd been positioned were regularly monitored to prevent anyone else from creating similar hazards. Daniel Cortez never returned to solo hiking in the Cascades, his experience having permanently altered his relationship with wilderness areas that had once seemed safe and peaceful. He testified at multiple trials, his accounts of being held captive providing crucial evidence about the organization's methods and the threats they'd made against anyone who interfered with their operations. Yone Mercier continued her search and rescue work, training new volunteers and sharing expertise that had proven valuable during one of the most complex operations the county had ever conducted. She'd been offered positions with professional search and rescue organizations, but she preferred the volunteer role that allowed her to maintain independence while contributing to her community's safety. 5 years after the investigation concluded, Keene stood once more in his office, looking toward the Cascade Peaks where everything had begun. The mountains appeared unchanged, their snow-covered peaks as beautiful and indifferent as they had been before criminal operations had tainted their wilderness with organized crime. But Keene knew that the appearance of emptiness was deceptive. That terrain, which seemed pristine and innocent, could conceal human activity of any kind for those willing to use isolation as both advantage and weapon. The beacon that had started everything had long since been returned to Daniel Cortez, its electronic signal silent, but its metaphorical transmission continuing through the changes it had triggered in how rural law enforcement approached wilderness areas and the threats that could hide within them. The signal had revealed not just a lost hiker, but an entire criminal enterprise, corruption within law enforcement, and vulnerabilities in the systems designed to protect communities from organized crime. Deputy Thorne had been promoted to chief deputy, filling the position left vacant by James Franklin's crimes and bringing to the role a combination of tactical competence and institutional skepticism that would make future corruption more difficult to establish. He'd implemented protocols that required multiple personnel to review and approve investigative decisions, creating redundancy that would prevent any single individual from suppressing reports or protecting criminal activity. The department operated with heightened awareness of its responsibilities and limitations, understanding that vigilance was a continuous requirement rather than a temporary response to crisis. The lesson that Keene had learned painfully was that criminal organizations would always probe for weaknesses in law enforcement systems, and that complacency, or assumption of safety, invited exactly the kinds of exploitation that had occurred during those 2 years when the Cascade Wilderness had served as a corridor for moving poison through communities. On winter evenings, when storms moved through the mountain passes, Keene sometimes thought about that November night when a beacon signal had triggered a search operation that uncovered something far more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The investigation had exposed his own department's failures and forced recognition that law enforcement in rural areas faced challenges that required different approaches than urban policing could provide. But it had also demonstrated that even sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated when law enforcement personnel remained committed to following evidence wherever it led, even when that meant investigating colleagues and exposing institutional failures. The price of that commitment had been high: careers destroyed, public trust damaged, and the comfortable assumption that small-town law enforcement operated in environments too isolated to interest organized crime permanently shattered. The Cascade Wilderness remained, beautiful and dangerous, offering both recreation and concealment to anyone who understood its terrain. The criminal organization that had exploited it for 2 years had been dismantled, its leaders imprisoned, and its infrastructure destroyed. But Keene understood that other organizations would eventually probe the same vulnerabilities, testing whether lessons learned during this investigation had truly changed how rural law enforcement protected the vast, empty spaces that defined so much of the American West. The beacon was silent now, its emergency signal long since deactivated. But the alarm it had raised continued echoing through law enforcement agencies, legislative committees, and communities that had discovered their isolation, made them vulnerable to threats that respected no boundaries and feared no consequences until confronted by determined opposition. Sheriff Thaddeus Keene continued serving Kittitas County, carrying knowledge that could never be unlearned, that evil flourished in darkness, that corruption could hide behind badges and oaths, and that the emptiness of wilderness was never truly empty, but rather filled with possibilities that ranged from transcendent beauty to calculated violence. The investigation had changed him in ways both obvious and subtle, replacing certainty with caution and comfort with vigilance that would never again permit assumption that silence meant safety in the mountains he'd sworn to protect. The storm came in from the Pacific with the kind of deliberate malice that made Sheriff Ephraim Calder respect the ocean more than he feared any criminal he'd encountered in 26 years of law enforcement. He stood on the dock at Port Defiance watching the harbor churn into gray chaos while the wind drove rain horizontally across the waterfront, thinking about the call that had come in 40 minutes earlier and what it might mean for the small coastal community he'd sworn to protect. The dispatcher's voice had carried unusual tension when reporting that commercial fishermen had found something in their nets that morning, something that wasn't fish and that required immediate law enforcement response. Clallam County occupied the northern tip of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, a landscape where dense rainforest met the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and small communities survived on logging, fishing, and the occasional tourist brave enough to venture into country that defined the word remote. Port Defiance was the county's primary fishing harbor, a collection of weathered docks and processing facilities where boats unloaded catches that fed markets as far away as Seattle and Portland. Calder had grown up in this town, watching his father work these same docks as a Marine deputy before him, and he understood that the harbor's rhythms and routines were as predictable as the tides themselves. When something disrupted those patterns, it usually meant trouble that extended beyond simple accidents or mechanical failures. Sergeant Boaz Whitcomb was waiting at the harbor master's office, his rain gear dripping puddles onto the worn linoleum floor as he reviewed notes from his initial response to the fisherman's report. Whitcomb ran the county's small marine unit, 3 patrol boats, and a handful of deputies who enforced maritime law across hundreds of square miles of coastal waters. He was a compact man in his early 40s, with the sun-weathered face of someone who spent more time on water than land, and the careful demeanor of someone who had learned that the ocean killed casually and without warning. Sheriff Calder, the fishing vessel Pacific Dawn brought something up in their nets about 6 miles northwest of here, Whitcomb began without preamble, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone delivering information he wished he didn't have to share. Captain says they were pulling salmon nets when they snagged on something heavy. When they hauled it aboard, they found industrial containers, waterproofed, and waited to stay on the bottom. They opened one container before calling us, and Sheriff, what's inside isn't legal cargo. Calder felt his investigative instincts activate. The mental shift from routine patrol work to something that would require resources and attention beyond normal operations. What kind of containers are we talking about? Size, construction, markings? Whitcomb consulted his notes, reading details that suggested careful planning rather than improvised smuggling. Cylindrical containers, approximately 4 feet long by 18 inches diameter, constructed from heavy-gauge PVC with waterproof seals. No external markings, but they're weighted with concrete to keep them neutrally buoyant at depth. The one they opened contained plastic-wrapped packages of what appears to be methamphetamine, pharmaceutical grade, probably 50 pounds worth. The implications expanded in Calder's mind like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. 50 pounds of methamphetamine represented street value in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, depending on purity and distribution networks. But more concerning than the drugs themselves was the sophistication of the concealment method. Underwater caches positioned to avoid detection while remaining accessible to people who knew their locations suggested organized criminal activity, with resources and planning capabilities that went far beyond typical rural drug trafficking. Where's the Pacific Dawn now, and has the captain been instructed to secure the remaining containers without opening them? Calder asked, already thinking through evidence preservation protocols and the cascade of agency notifications this discovery would trigger. Boats still at sea, holding position at the coordinates where they found the containers, Whitcomb replied. I instructed the captain to leave everything sealed and await our arrival. But Sheriff, there's something else you need to know. When I asked how many containers they'd pulled up, the captain said they only got 2 before their winch couldn't handle the weight. He estimates there might be 20 or more containers down there, arranged in what felt like a deliberate pattern rather than random placement. 20 containers at 50 pounds each would represent 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine, an amount that transformed this from a significant drug seizure into something approaching industrial-scale trafficking. The Pacific Northwest had seen increasing problems with methamphetamine distribution over recent years, but this suggested operations at a level that would require investigation beyond what Calder's small department could handle independently. He would need federal resources, probably DEA and Coast Guard involvement, and coordination with agencies whose bureaucratic procedures often moved slower than investigations required. Boaz, I want you to take your patrol boat out to the Pacific Dawn's location and secure that scene, Calder ordered, making decisions that would determine how the investigation proceeded. Don't attempt to recover any more containers until we have proper evidence response capabilities on site. I'm going to contact DEA and Coast Guard, get federal resources mobilized. This is beyond our capacity to handle alone." The Marine Unit's patrol boat was a rigid-hull inflatable designed for coastal operations, equipped with navigation and communication equipment that allowed operations in conditions that would defeat smaller craft. Calder watched Whitcomb and 2 deputies prepare for departure, their movements practiced and efficient despite the storm conditions that made the harbor a churning mass of gray water and driving rain. The boat disappeared into the weather within minutes, leaving Calder standing on the dock contemplating the reality that his quiet coastal county had just been revealed as a waypoint for drug trafficking on a scale that suggested organized criminal networks with national or international reach. The harbor master's office provided shelter, while Calder made the notifications that would transform this from a local investigation into a multi-agency operation. The DEA field office in Seattle responded with immediate interest, promising to dispatch agents and evidence specialists within hours. The Coast Guard committed a cutter and helicopter support for recovery operations and security. The state police offered personnel and coordination assistance. Within 90 minutes of the initial report, Calder had assembled resources that dwarfed anything his department could provide independently, but he also knew that federal involvement meant surrendering control over investigative direction and accepting that local concerns would be subordinated to broader enforcement priorities. County Coroner Maud Ellery arrived at the harbor master's office as Calder was concluding his agency notifications. Ellery was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who had served as coroner for 12 years after a career as a forensic pathologist in Seattle. She'd returned to the Olympic Peninsula after her husband's death, seeking the slower pace of rural medicine, but bringing with her expertise that proved invaluable during the occasional cases that required sophisticated forensic analysis. "Sheriff Calder, I heard radio traffic about a significant drug seizure at sea," Ellery said, shaking rain from her jacket as she entered the office. "I came down because experience suggests that where you find large-scale drug operations, you often find bodies. Has anyone checked whether those containers might hold more than just contraband?" The question was valid and unsettling. Drug trafficking organizations were known to eliminate witnesses, dispose of rivals, and create examples that discouraged interference with their operations. If the underwater cache had been used for more than just drug storage, there might be human remains among the containers that fishermen had discovered. Calder hadn't considered this possibility, but Ellery's forensic background made her suggestion worth investigating. "The fishermen only opened one container, and it held packaged drugs," Calder replied. "But you're right that we should check the others before assuming they're all contraband. I'll make sure the evidence recovery team examines every container carefully." The afternoon progressed with the organized chaos of multiple agencies converging on a small harbor that wasn't designed to accommodate the volume of official activity suddenly focused on its facilities. DEA agents arrived in government vehicles, bringing equipment and expertise for evidence documentation. Coast Guard personnel established command presence and began coordinating maritime security. State police set up perimeter control and began the background investigation that would eventually identify who was operating the underwater cache and how long it had been in place. Calder found himself managing interfaces between agencies whose jurisdictional concerns and bureaucratic requirements often conflicted with the practical need to secure evidence and develop investigative leads. Federal agents wanted immediate control over all evidence and investigation, while his responsibility as county sheriff required maintaining local law enforcement presence and protecting community interests. The negotiation of these competing priorities consumed hours that could have been spent on actual investigative work, but Calder understood that interagency cooperation required patience with processes that seemed inefficient, but ultimately produced better outcomes than territorial conflicts. By evening, the weather had deteriorated further, forcing suspension of recovery operations until conditions improved. The Pacific Dawn had been escorted back to harbor with the 2 containers they'd already recovered, both now secured as evidence under federal custody. Whitcomb's patrol boat returned with documentation of the underwater cache site, including sonar images that confirmed at least 18 additional containers arranged in a grid pattern on the seafloor, approximately 60 feet below the surface. The DEA lead agent, a career narcotics investigator named Patricia Voss, reviewed the sonar images with the intensity of someone who understood that the cache represented not just seized drugs, but intelligence about organizational methods and capabilities that could inform investigations across multiple jurisdictions. She'd worked drug cases throughout the Pacific Northwest for 15 years, and her experience made her assessment of the situation particularly sobering. Sheriff Calder, this cache setup represents sophisticated maritime operations, Voss explained, as they studied the sonar imagery in the harbor master's office. The positioning, the weighting, the waterproofing, this wasn't improvised by casual smugglers. We're looking at people with maritime expertise, probably former military or commercial diving backgrounds, who've established infrastructure for regular operations. Calder absorbed this assessment while studying the cache pattern on the sonar images. How long do you estimate this cache has been operational? Voss considered the question carefully before responding. The containers show marine growth consistent with several months of submersion, but the arrangement suggests this is an active site rather than abandoned material. My working theory is that this cache serves as a transfer point. Product is deposited by one group and retrieved by another, minimizing direct contact between transportation and distribution elements of the organization. The operational sophistication suggested criminal networks with resources and planning capabilities that went far beyond what Calder had encountered during his career in rural law enforcement. Drug trafficking had always been present in coastal communities, but typically at the retail level involving small quantities and local dealers. This cache represented wholesale operations that implied connections to production facilities, transportation networks, and distribution systems spanning hundreds or thousands of miles. Agent Voss, what's your assessment of how we should proceed with this investigation? Calder asked, recognizing that federal expertise would be essential for understanding and dismantling whatever organization was operating the cache. Voss's response reflected years of experience investigating complex drug trafficking operations. We need to approach this carefully. The organization operating this cache doesn't know yet that it's been discovered. The fishermen found it accidentally while working legitimate grounds. If we conduct obvious recovery operations and broadcast that we've seized their product, they'll abandon this infrastructure and establish new transfer points elsewhere. But if we can surveil the site and wait for them to attempt to pick up or deposit, we might identify the people involved and develop leads that could dismantle the entire network. The surveillance strategy made tactical sense, but it also meant delaying seizure of 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine while waiting for criminals to reveal themselves. Calder understood the investigative logic, but he also knew that every day those drugs remained in place represented potential distribution and the damage that would cause in communities already struggling with addiction epidemics. The decision about how to balance immediate seizure against long-term investigative goals would need to involve more than just law enforcement considerations. As night settled over Port Defiance, Calder stood once more on the dock, watching the storm continue its assault on the harbor. Somewhere beneath those churning waters sat evidence of criminal operations that had been using his county's coastal waters as infrastructure for trafficking drugs throughout the region. The discovery raised questions about how long such operations had been active, who in the local community might be involved or aware, and what other criminal activities might be hidden in the waters and forests that surrounded these small coastal towns. The investigation had just begun, but Calder already understood that it would reveal uncomfortable truths about how organized crime could establish itself in communities that believed their isolation protected them from the kind of sophisticated criminal operations associated with cities and international borders. The ocean that had always defined life on the Olympic Peninsula was showing itself to be not a barrier against criminal activity, but rather a highway that connected Port Defiance to drug trafficking networks operating on a scale that dwarfed anything the community had previously encountered. The surveillance operation began at dawn when the storm had exhausted itself into drizzle, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca settled into the kind of deceptive calm that veteran mariners knew could shift back to violence within hours. Sheriff Calder stood on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter that would serve as command platform for monitoring the underwater cache site, watching Sergeant Whitcomb coordinate the deployment of surveillance equipment that would document any attempt to access the containers. The operation required resources from 4 federal agencies and 2 state departments, all compressed into a coastal area where the wrong radio transmission or visible patrol boat could alert the criminal organization that their cache had been compromised. Agent Voss had designed the surveillance strategy with the kind of methodical attention that came from years of investigating organizations sophisticated enough to detect law enforcement presence through subtle changes in routine patterns. No additional boats would patrol near the cache site. No aircraft would conduct obvious surveillance. Instead, the Coast Guard cutter would maintain position several miles away, while underwater acoustic sensors monitored the cache location for sounds of diving equipment or mechanical disturbance. Whitcomb's deputies would conduct what appeared to be routine harbor patrols, but would actually be documenting vessel movements and identifying boats that might be positioned to access the cache site. The challenge is that we're working blind regarding their operational timeline, Voss explained during the morning briefing in the cutter's wardroom. We don't know if they check this cache daily, weekly, or monthly. We don't know if the recent storm might have disrupted their schedule. And we don't know if they have monitoring capabilities that would detect the acoustic sensors we've positioned. This could be a 24-hour operation, or it could take weeks. Calder understood the uncertainties, but he also recognized that patience in surveillance often produced intelligence that aggressive enforcement couldn't achieve. What's our protocol if they do attempt to access the cache? Do we interdict immediately or continue surveillance to identify additional elements of their organization? The question reflected the eternal tension in drug investigations between seizing contraband to prevent distribution and maintaining surveillance to understand organizational structure. Voss had clearly been wrestling with this balance throughout the planning phase, and her response reflected the complexity of the decision. If we observe a single individual or small team accessing the cache, we continue surveillance and attempt to follow them to identify distribution networks or command elements, Voss said. But if we detect what appears to be wholesale removal of multiple containers, we interdict immediately to prevent that much product from entering distribution. The acoustic sensors will give us real-time notification of any activity at the cache site, which should provide enough warning to make tactical decisions based on what we observe. The briefing continued with technical details about communication protocols, vessel positioning, and contingency plans for various scenarios the surveillance might encounter. Calder found himself impressed by the sophistication of federal resources being deployed, but also increasingly aware that his role was shifting from active investigator to liaison between federal operations and local community concerns. The transformation was inevitable, given the scale of the investigation, but it left him feeling marginalized in a case that was happening in his jurisdiction and would ultimately affect his community most directly. Maud Ellery had requested permission to examine the 2 containers that had already been recovered, arguing that her forensic expertise might reveal details about their construction and handling that could provide investigative leads. Calder had supported this request despite federal reluctance to allow local involvement in evidence analysis, recognizing that Ellery's background brought capabilities that might not be replicated in federal laboratories focused primarily on drug chemistry rather than forensic reconstruction. The examination took place in a secure warehouse that the Coast Guard had commandeered for evidence processing. Ellery worked with methodical precision, documenting every aspect of the container's construction and contents, while DEA chemists analyzed the methamphetamine samples for purity and chemical signatures that might identify production facilities. Calder observed the examination, learning details that painted an increasingly sophisticated picture of the criminal organization's capabilities. "Sheriff, look at the welds on these containers," Ellery said, pointing to the seams where the PVC cylinders had been sealed. "This is professional fabrication work, not improvised construction. Whoever built these has metalworking expertise and access to industrial equipment. The waterproofing system uses marine-grade sealants that are expensive and specialized. These containers were designed by people who understand underwater operations and have resources to implement professional solutions." The DEA chemist, a woman named Sandra Kovich, had completed preliminary analysis of the methamphetamine, and her findings added another dimension to understanding the organization's operations. "Sheriff Calder, this methamphetamine is exceptionally pure, probably 95% or better. That level of purity suggests industrial production facilities rather than improvised labs. The chemical signature indicates production methods consistent with Mexican cartel operations, which means we're likely looking at product that's traveled through established distribution networks from source countries. The combination of professional container fabrication and cartel-grade methamphetamine suggested organizational connections that extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest. What had appeared to be a regional trafficking operation was revealing itself as a node in networks that might stretch from Mexico through the United States and potentially into Canada. The implications for investigation and prosecution were staggering, requiring coordination across international borders and multiple federal agencies with sometimes conflicting priorities and jurisdictional authorities. Calder spent the afternoon reviewing background information on Port Defiance's maritime community, looking for individuals or businesses that might have the capabilities and connections to operate the underwater cache. The fishing industry employed dozens of boats and hundreds of workers, many with diving experience and intimate knowledge of coastal waters. The waterfront included marine fabrication shops that could produce the specialized containers, welding services that could seal them properly, and transport companies that moved cargo along the coast with minimal oversight. What troubled Calder most was the realization that operating the cache would require not just technical capabilities but also local knowledge about tides, currents, and seasonal patterns that affected underwater conditions. Someone from the community, or someone who had spent considerable time learning the area's maritime characteristics, had to be involved in positioning and maintaining the cache. The investigation would eventually require examining people Calder had known for years, questioning their activities and associations in ways that would damage relationships and trust, regardless of whether evidence of wrongdoing emerged. Sergeant Whitcomb returned from harbor patrols that evening with information that confirmed Calder's concerns about local involvement. "Sheriff, I've been documenting vessel movements and talking to captains about their recent activities. 3 separate boats have mentioned noticing unusual dive operations in the general area where the cache was found. They described seeing a commercial dive vessel working at night, which struck them as odd since most legitimate dive operations occurred during daylight for safety reasons. The vessel was professional-looking, dive flags properly displayed, but nobody recognized the boat or knew what company it belonged to." The description of nighttime dive operations near the cache site was precisely the kind of intelligence that could break an investigation open if properly pursued. "Did anyone get identification numbers or take photographs of this dive vessel?" Calder asked. One captain took a cell phone photo because he thought it was unusual, Whitcomb replied, pulling out his phone to display the image. The vessel appears to be a converted fishing boat, maybe 40 feet, with professional dive equipment visible on deck. But Sheriff, look at this. No identification numbers visible on the hull, and the registration numbers that should be displayed on the bow appear to have been covered or removed. The photograph showed exactly what Whitcomb had described: a professional dive operation conducted by people who didn't want to be identified or tracked through normal vessel registration systems. Calder felt the investigation focusing as details accumulated that would eventually identify the individuals operating the cache. The challenge would be connecting observed activities to specific people quickly enough to prevent the organization from detecting surveillance and abandoning their infrastructure. Agent Voss reviewed the photograph and vessel description with immediate interest, recognizing its potential value for the investigation. This is exactly the kind of operational intelligence we need. If we can identify this dive vessel and determine where it operates from, we can establish surveillance on their base of operations and potentially identify the entire local cell of the organization. Sheriff, I need your Marine unit to quietly canvass the waterfront and nearby harbors, see if anyone recognizes this vessel or knows where it might be berthed. The canvass of waterfront businesses and harbors began immediately, with Whitcomb and his deputies conducting what appeared to be routine liaison contacts, while actually showing the photograph and gathering intelligence about unusual dive operations. The search expanded beyond Port Defiance to include smaller harbors and private marinas along the coast, anywhere that a 40-foot vessel might dock without attracting official attention. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly harbor worker at a small private marina 15 miles south of Port Defiance recognized the vessel in the photograph as one that had been using their facilities irregularly for the past 6 months. The boat arrived without notice, stayed for a day or two, then departed without interaction with other marina users. The owner paid cash in advance for moorage and declined offers of services or maintenance assistance. The marina had registration information showing the vessel belonged to a company called Olympic Marine Services, with a mailing address that Calder's subsequent investigation revealed was a mail drop facility in Seattle. This is the pattern we see with criminal front companies, Voss explained when reviewing the registration information. Minimal documentation, cash transactions, deliberately vague business descriptions that could cover any type of maritime activity. Olympic Marine Services probably exists only on paper to provide cover for this dive vessel's operations. The surveillance team began monitoring the private marina where the dive vessel was berthed, documenting activity and preparing to track the boat if it attempted to access the underwater cache. The operation was complicated by the marina's remote location and the limited law enforcement presence that could be maintained without alerting anyone who might be watching for surveillance. Calder found himself coordinating an increasingly complex deployment of personnel and resources across a coastal area where every boat movement and unfamiliar face might trigger suspicion. The acoustic sensors positioned at the cache site remained silent through 2 days of intensive surveillance, suggesting either that the organization's operational cycle didn't require immediate access or that they had detected something suspicious and were staying away from their cache. The waiting created tension among investigators, eager for action and results. But Voss maintained strict discipline about not conducting aggressive investigation that might compromise the surveillance operation. On the 3rd night of surveillance, the acoustic sensors detected sounds consistent with diving activity at the cache site. The Coast Guard cutter began moving toward the location while remaining far enough away to avoid detection, and Whitcomb's patrol boats positioned themselves to observe surface vessels that might be supporting dive operations. The operation was unfolding exactly as the surveillance plan had anticipated, but Calder felt the familiar tension of situations where tactical plans confronted the unpredictable reality of human behavior and changing circumstances. The dive vessel from the private marina was observed departing its berth at 23:40 hours, moving without running lights into coastal waters toward the cache site. The Coast Guard tracked the vessel using infrared cameras that revealed its position without requiring visible proximity. As the dive boat reached the cache area, thermal imaging detected individuals entering the water with equipment consistent with commercial diving operations. The acoustic sensors confirmed that someone was working at the cache site, presumably retrieving containers that the organization needed to move into distribution networks. We've got positive confirmation of criminal activity at the cache site, the Coast Guard watch officer reported over the tactical frequency. Multiple divers working the containers, surface vessel maintaining position. This is the pickup operation we've been waiting for. Request guidance on interdiction timing. Calder listened to Agent Voss making the tactical decision that would determine how the operation proceeded. Her voice carried the controlled intensity of someone who understood that the next minutes would either produce major investigative breakthroughs or result in suspects escaping with evidence that would never be recovered. Coast Guard, this is DEA Command. Move to intercept the surface vessel, but do not approach until the divers have surfaced and reboarded. We want them with containers in possession to establish possession charges. All units maintain communications discipline and execute interdiction on my command. The Coast Guard cutter accelerated toward the cache site, covering the distance with professional efficiency while coordinating with Whitcomb's patrol boats to establish a perimeter that would prevent the dive vessel from escaping. The operation was textbook maritime law enforcement. But Calder understood that everything depended on timing the interdiction precisely to catch the suspects with evidence while preventing them from jettisoning containers or escaping in ways that would complicate prosecution. The dive vessel was attempting to depart the area when Coast Guard spotlights suddenly illuminated it, transforming night into brilliant daylight and announcing law enforcement presence in a way that left no doubt about what was happening. The vessel initially attempted to run, but the Coast Guard cutter's superior speed and maneuverability made escape impossible. Within minutes, the dive boat was stopped and boarded, its crew of 3 men taken into custody while evidence technicians documented 6 containers visible on deck that had clearly been retrieved from the underwater cache. Calder watched the interdiction from Whitcomb's patrol boat, feeling satisfaction at the successful operation, but also understanding that this arrest was just the beginning of an investigation that would extend far beyond these 3 individuals. The real question was whether any of them would cooperate with investigators to provide information about the organization's structure and leadership, or whether they would remain silent and force prosecutors to build cases based solely on physical evidence and surveillance documentation. The interrogation room at the Clallam County Sheriff's Department had been converted into a joint federal-local interview facility, with recording equipment that would document every conversation for eventual use in prosecutions that might span multiple jurisdictions. Sheriff Calder sat beside Agent Voss as they prepared to interview the first of the 3 men arrested during the cache interdiction, reviewing background information that painted an increasingly troubling picture of how deeply criminal operations had penetrated the local maritime community. The arrested men were Kenneth Marsh, Thomas Pryor, and Dale Hutchins, all commercial divers with legitimate backgrounds in underwater construction and salvage operations, who had apparently decided that criminal enterprises offered better compensation than honest work. Marsh was 43 years old, a veteran of offshore oil platform work who had returned to the Pacific Northwest 5 years earlier and established himself as an independent contractor for marine construction projects. His background check revealed no criminal record beyond minor traffic violations, making him exactly the type of person who could operate in legitimate maritime circles without attracting suspicion. He sat across the interview table with the calm demeanor of someone who had decided that cooperation might serve his interests better than silence, though Calder remained skeptical about how much information Marsh would actually provide. "Mr. Marsh, you've been advised of your rights and you've indicated willingness to speak with us without an attorney present," Agent Voss began, following protocols that would protect the admissibility of any statements Marsh made. "We want to understand your involvement with the underwater cache that was discovered off Port Defiance and the organization that's been using it for drug trafficking. Start by telling us how you became involved in this operation." Marsh leaned back in his chair, making a visible calculation about how much to reveal and what advantages cooperation might provide. "I was approached about 8 months ago by someone who needed professional diving services for what he described as salvage work. The money was excellent. $5,000 per dive to position or retrieve containers at specific underwater locations. I didn't ask questions about what was in the containers because I didn't want to know. That kind of money for simple diving work, you understand it's not legitimate, but the work itself wasn't dangerous or complicated." "Who approached you with this offer?" Calder asked, needing identification of whoever had recruited Marsh into the criminal organization. "Man named Victor Salazar. He said he represented a marine salvage company that handled sensitive cargo for clients who valued discretion. Met him at a bar in Port Angeles, seemed professional, had documentation showing he was authorized to hire subcontractors. Sheriff, I know how this sounds, but at the time it seemed like a gray area rather than obviously criminal activity." Agent Voss pulled up a photograph database on her laptop, scrolling through images of known drug trafficking associates until she found the individual she was looking for. "Is this Victor Salazar?" she asked, turning the screen toward Marsh. Marsh studied the photograph for several seconds before nodding confirmation. "That's him, but the identification he showed me had a different name, Richard Salazar. Is he someone you've been investigating?" "Victor Salazar is a known associate of Mexican cartel operations in the Pacific Northwest," Voss explained. "He's been connected to multiple drug trafficking investigations but has avoided prosecution through careful distance from direct operations. If he recruited you, it means the organization has been specifically targeting people with diving expertise to support their underwater cache operations. How many times did you conduct dives for Salazar, and were the other 2 men arrested with you also working for him?" Marsh's cooperation was producing exactly the kind of intelligence that could transform a simple drug seizure into a comprehensive investigation of organizational structure and methods. "I did maybe 12 dives over 8 months, always at different locations along the coast. Salazar would provide GPS coordinates and specific instructions about depth and positioning. The other guys, Pryor and Hutchins, they were brought in about 4 months ago when the operation expanded and Salazar needed additional dive capacity. We never discussed what we were doing with each other, just showed up when called and did the work. Did you ever meet anyone else from the organization besides Salazar?" Calder asked, trying to map the network of people involved in the operation. "There were people on the support vessel during dives, but we never got names or had conversations beyond operational coordination. Professional operation, Sheriff. Everyone stayed in their lane and didn't ask questions about what other people were doing. That's how I knew this was serious criminal enterprise rather than some amateur smuggling. The discipline and compartmentalization were military grade. The description of operational security suggested sophistication that went beyond typical drug trafficking organizations operating in rural areas. Calder recognized the patterns from his years investigating organized crime, the careful separation of roles, the limited communication between participants, the use of legitimate skills for criminal purposes. What troubled him most was understanding that this organization had been operating in his county for at least 8 months without triggering any law enforcement attention until fishermen accidentally discovered the cache. Agent Voss shifted the interrogation toward understanding the organization's broader operations and whether additional caches existed beyond the one that had been discovered. "Mr. Marsh, you mentioned conducting dives at different locations along the coast. Were you positioning multiple caches or moving product between locations? Both, Marsh admitted, his willingness to cooperate apparently overcoming any remaining loyalty to the organization. Some dives were positioning new caches. Others were relocating containers from sites that Salazar said had become compromised or were no longer secure. He never explained what made a site compromised, just provided new coordinates and instructions. Based on the work I did, I'd estimate there are at least 5 or 6 active caches along the Washington coast, maybe more that other divers were handling. The revelation that multiple underwater caches existed transformed the investigation's scope from a single drug seizure to a systematic enforcement operation that would require coordinating resources across hundreds of miles of coastline. Calder felt the already complex case expanding beyond anything his department could handle independently, requiring sustained federal involvement and resources that might take months or years to fully deploy. "Can you provide locations for the other cache sites you worked on?" Voss asked, pulling up a nautical chart on her laptop. Marsh studied the chart, pointing to areas where he remembered conducting dive operations. The coordinates were always provided electronically and I never wrote them down, but I remember general areas. There was one site near Nia Bay, another south of here near the Ho River mouth, and at least 2 others in areas that weren't close to any major towns or harbors. The pattern seemed to be selecting locations that were deep enough to avoid casual discovery, but accessible to boats that knew what they were looking for. Whitcomb had been listening to the interrogation from the observation room, and he entered now with additional questions based on his maritime expertise. "Mr. Marsh, were these caches always positioned in federal waters, or were some in state jurisdiction? And were they using any kind of marking system that would allow the organization to relocate the caches without sophisticated navigation equipment?" The questions reflected Whitcomb's understanding that underwater cache operations required balancing concealment against the practical need to find containers that could be hundreds of yards away from surface reference points. Marsh's answers would help investigators understand the technical methods the organization used and potentially identify ways to locate additional caches. The caches were always in water deep enough to avoid casual detection, but shallow enough for commercial diving without special equipment, usually 40 to 80 feet depth, Marsh explained. They weren't marked with anything visible from the surface, but Salazar provided GPS coordinates that were accurate within a few feet. With modern navigation equipment, you can position yourself directly over underwater objects without any surface markers. The organization was using professional maritime technology, not improvised systems. The interrogation continued for another hour, as Marsh provided details about the dive vessel, the support equipment used, and his observations about the organization's operations. By the time Agent Voss concluded the interview, they had intelligence that would support search warrants, additional arrests, and expanded investigation into the network of people and businesses supporting the drug trafficking operation. The other 2 arrested divers, Pryor and Hutchins, proved less cooperative during their initial interrogations, both requesting attorneys before making any substantive statements. Their silence was frustrating but not unexpected, as experienced criminals often understood that cooperation carried risks from their organization that might exceed any benefits from law enforcement. Marsh's willingness to talk made him the exception rather than the rule, and Calder knew that building comprehensive cases would require developing evidence beyond witness testimony. Maud Ellery had been conducting detailed examination of the containers recovered during the interdiction, and she requested a meeting with Calder to share findings that added new dimensions to understanding the organization's capabilities. They met in the evidence processing facility where the containers were secured, with Ellery displaying forensic analysis results on a laptop while physically demonstrating features she'd discovered during examination. "Sheriff, these containers represent engineering sophistication that goes beyond simple waterproofing." Ellery began, pointing to internal mechanisms visible in one of the opened cylinders. Look at this pressure equalization system. It's designed to allow the containers to adjust to depth changes without imploding or developing leaks. This level of engineering requires expertise in underwater systems and access to specialized fabrication capabilities. Whoever built these containers has either military or commercial diving experience at a professional level. Calder examined the pressure equalization mechanisms, seeing the kind of technical sophistication that confirmed the organization's professional capabilities. Can we trace the components or identify where these containers were manufactured? The components are commercially available through marine supply companies, but the assembly and integration required custom fabrication work, Ellery explained. I've been contacting fabrication shops along the coast to see if anyone recognizes the welding patterns or construction methods. It's a long shot, but sometimes craftsmen leave signatures in their work that can be identified by other professionals. The forensic investigation was producing the kind of detailed technical evidence that could support prosecutions, even if witnesses remained silent or recanted their testimony. Calder appreciated Ellery's methodical approach and her willingness to pursue investigative leads that might not produce immediate results, but could prove crucial during trial proceedings. Agent Voss had been coordinating with DEA offices throughout the Pacific Northwest to share intelligence about the underwater cache network and identify whether similar operations were occurring in other jurisdictions. Her findings confirmed that the organization was operating across a wide geographic area, with evidence of cache operations in Oregon, coastal waters, and possibly extending into British Columbia. The pattern suggested a distribution network that used the entire Pacific coast as infrastructure, moving product from southern sources to northern markets while exploiting maritime environments that offered concealment and operational flexibility. Sheriff Calder, we're looking at an organization that's been operating across international borders using methods that standard law enforcement wasn't designed to detect, Voss said during an evening briefing. The underwater caches represent just one component of their operations. There are probably overland transportation routes, urban distribution networks, and financial systems that move the profits. Dismantling this organization will require sustained investigation over months or years, with coordination across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The scope of what they were confronting was sobering, but Calder understood that the alternative to sustained investigation was accepting that criminal organizations would continue exploiting the vulnerabilities of coastal communities and maritime environments. What's our immediate priority for continuing this investigation? He asked. We need to locate and secure the other cache sites that Marsh identified, conduct surveillance to determine if anyone else from the organization attempts to access them, and execute search warrants on the businesses and properties connected to Victor Salazar, Voss replied. Those operations will generate additional evidence and hopefully identify higher-level members of the organization. But, Sheriff, I need to be honest with you. This investigation has revealed something about your local community that you need to address. Calder felt his attention sharpen, recognizing that Voss was preparing to deliver information that would be uncomfortable. What have you found? The organization has been operating in Port Defiance for at least 8 months, conducting regular maritime operations that required local knowledge and presumably local support, Voss said carefully. They couldn't maintain multiple cache sites and conduct dozens of dive operations without someone in the community being aware or providing assistance. That means there are probably additional people involved beyond the 3 divers we arrested: boat operators, dock workers, equipment suppliers. Sheriff, you need to prepare for the possibility that investigating this organization will require examining people who are part of your community's maritime industry. The implication was clear and deeply troubling. The investigation that had started with an accidental discovery by fishermen was revealing that criminal operations had established themselves within the fabric of Port Defiance's economy and social networks. Finding and prosecuting everyone involved would require investigations that would damage relationships, destroy reputations, and potentially harm innocent people whose only crime was failing to report suspicious activities they might have noticed. Calder stood at the window of the evidence facility looking toward the harbor where boats were preparing for evening departures, their crews going about the business of commercial fishing that had sustained this community for generations. Somewhere among those boats and those workers were people who had facilitated or tolerated criminal operations, either through active participation or passive acceptance of activities they understood were wrong. The investigation would eventually identify them, and the process would reveal uncomfortable truths about how organized crime could flourish when communities chose not to see what was happening in their midst. The search warrant execution on the warehouse facility connected to Olympic Marine Services took place at dawn 3 days after the initial arrests, coordinated between federal agents, state police, and Whitcomb's Marine deputies. Sheriff Calder stood outside the corrugated metal building on the outskirts of Port Defiance, watching tactical teams secure the perimeter, while evidence technicians prepared to document whatever they found inside. The warehouse had been identified through financial records traced from the mail drop address in Seattle, revealing a paper trail that connected the dive vessel to a legitimate-appearing marine services company that existed primarily as cover for criminal operations. The interior of the warehouse revealed the sophisticated infrastructure that the organization had established to support their underwater cash network. Professional dive equipment filled one section: tanks, regulators, dry suits, and specialized gear for working in cold Pacific waters. Another area contained fabrication tools and materials for constructing the waterproof containers, including welding equipment, PVC stock, and marine sealant supplies. But most damning was a small office that contained detailed logs of cache operations, GPS coordinates for multiple underwater sites, and financial records documenting transactions that totaled millions of dollars over 18 months of operations. Agent Voss examined the logbooks with the focused intensity of someone who understood that documentary evidence could often prove more valuable than witness testimony. Sheriff Calder, these records document a systematic operation that's been running since approximately 14 months ago. Look at this. They've been conducting cache operations at 7 different sites along the Washington coast, with pickup and deposit schedules that suggest regular distribution cycles. This is industrial-scale trafficking using methods specifically designed to evade maritime law enforcement. Calder studied the logs, seeing patterns that confirmed his worst concerns about how long criminal operations had been active in his jurisdiction. These dates go back to before I received any reports about suspicious maritime activity. If the organization has been operating this long without detection, it suggests either we weren't looking for the right indicators, or someone was actively preventing information from reaching investigators. The possibility of internal corruption had been haunting Calder since the investigation began, reflecting the same concerns he'd heard about in other rural jurisdictions where criminal organizations had successfully compromised law enforcement personnel. Small departments with limited oversight and close personal relationships between officers and community members created vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals could exploit through careful cultivation of corrupt contacts. Maud Ellery had been examining the container fabrication area, taking photographs and collecting samples that might provide forensic links between the warehouse and the containers recovered from the underwater caches. She called Calder over to examine something she'd discovered in a storage cabinet that added a disturbing dimension to understanding the organization's activities. "Sheriff, look at what else they were manufacturing here," Ellery said, opening the cabinet to reveal items that made Calder's blood run cold. Inside were restraints, chains, and equipment that had no legitimate purpose in marine salvage operations. These appeared to be designed for securing people, not cargo. I think we need to consider the possibility that this organization has been involved in activities beyond drug trafficking. The realization that the warehouse might have been used for human trafficking or other violent crimes transformed the investigation from a drug case into something that would require examining whether victims existed who hadn't yet been identified. Calder immediately called for additional evidence technicians and requested that Ellery conduct a comprehensive forensic examination of the entire facility looking for biological evidence that might indicate criminal violence had occurred on the premises. "Agent Voss, we need to expand the scope of this investigation," Calder said. "If this organization has been using these facilities for human trafficking or other violent crimes, there may be victims we haven't discovered yet. I want cadaver dogs brought in to search the property and surrounding areas, and I want every transaction record examined for evidence of human trafficking activity." The expanded investigation consumed the next week as teams systematically processed the warehouse and surrounding property. Cadaver dogs detected disturbed soil in an area behind the building, leading to excavation that revealed nothing more than construction debris and discarded equipment. Financial records were analyzed for patterns that might indicate human trafficking, but the coded entries made definitive identification impossible without additional context that only organizational insiders could provide. Sergeant Whitcomb had been conducting his own investigation within Port Defiance's maritime community, quietly interviewing workers and boat operators about their observations of unusual activity over the past year. His findings were painting an increasingly troubling picture of how the criminal organization had embedded itself in the community's economic and social fabric through a combination of intimidation, corruption, and the exploitation of financial desperation that affected many commercial fishing operations struggling with declining catches and increasing costs. "Sheriff, I've identified at least 6 dock workers and boat operators who admit they were aware of suspicious diving operations but didn't report them," Whitcomb said during a confidential briefing. "Their reasons vary. Some were afraid of retaliation, others were receiving payments for looking the other way, and a few genuinely believed they were observing legitimate salvage operations and didn't understand they were witnessing criminal activity. But the common factor is that information wasn't reaching law enforcement because people either chose not to report or were actively discouraged from reporting." The culture of silence that Whitcomb had identified was exactly the kind of community complicity that allowed organized crime to flourish in rural areas where social bonds and economic interdependence created pressure to avoid causing trouble for neighbors, even when their activities violated the law. Breaking through that silence would require demonstrating that law enforcement would protect witnesses and that cooperation served community interests better than passive acceptance of criminal operations. Calder authorized Whitcomb to offer immunity from minor charges to witnesses who came forward with information about the organization's operations, a controversial decision that would protect people who had technically violated the law through their failure to report criminal activity, but whose testimony was essential for building comprehensive cases against higher-level organizational members. The immunity offers produced results, with several dock workers and boat operators providing information that filled gaps in investigators' understanding of how the organization had operated. The testimony revealed that Victor Salazar had been a regular presence in Port Defiance, cultivating relationships with maritime workers and presenting himself as a successful salvage operator who occasionally needed local expertise for specialized projects. He'd been generous with money, buying drinks at waterfront bars and offering cash payments for minor services that gradually escalated to more serious involvement in operations that people eventually understood were criminal. The pattern was classic organized crime methodology: identifying vulnerable individuals, building relationships based on economic benefits, then gradually increasing involvement until people felt too compromised to withdraw or report what they knew. Salazar was specifically targeting people who were struggling financially, one dock worker told Calder during a recorded interview. He knew who was behind on boat payments, who had medical bills they couldn't pay, who was facing bankruptcy. He'd offer help that seemed harmless at first: a loan, a side job that paid well, assistance with paperwork or permits. Then, gradually, the requests would get more questionable. But by that point, you were already taking his money and felt like you couldn't refuse without consequences. The testimony painted a picture of systematic corruption of a community that was economically vulnerable and geographically isolated, making it an ideal environment for criminal operations that needed local support and cooperation. Calder understood that prosecuting the low-level participants would accomplish little beyond destroying more lives in a community that had already been damaged by the organization's presence. The focus needed to remain on identifying and prosecuting the organizational leadership while providing support and immunity to witnesses whose cooperation would make those prosecutions possible. Agent Voss had been coordinating with DEA offices in Mexico and California to develop intelligence about Victor Salazar's background and connections to larger trafficking networks. Her findings confirmed that Salazar was a mid-level operative in a Mexican cartel organization that had been expanding operations into the Pacific Northwest, using the underwater cache network as part of a sophisticated distribution system that moved product from southern production facilities to northern markets, while avoiding the border checkpoints and highway interdictions that had made overland trafficking increasingly risky. Sheriff Calder, we've identified that Salazar reports to a cartel cell leader based in Tijuana who manages trafficking operations throughout the western United States, Voss explained during an intelligence briefing. The underwater cache system represents just one of their distribution methods. They're also using commercial shipping containers, cross-border tunnels, and corrupted port facilities. Dismantling the organization will require coordination with Mexican authorities and potentially international law enforcement agencies. The scope of what they were confronting continued expanding beyond anything that local resources could address independently. Calder found himself increasingly marginalized in an investigation that had begun in his jurisdiction, but now involved agencies and authorities whose priorities and methods didn't always align with local community interests. The tension between federal enforcement goals and local consequences was becoming more apparent as the investigation proceeded. The arrest of Victor Salazar came 3 weeks after the initial cache discovery, executed by federal agents in Seattle, where surveillance had tracked him to a hotel meeting with associates. The arrest was coordinated with simultaneous operations in California and Mexico that targeted other members of the trafficking organization, resulting in indictments against 47 individuals across 3 countries. The scale of the enforcement action demonstrated the resources and coordination that federal agencies could deploy when investigating international drug trafficking, but it also meant that local cases and concerns would be subsumed into prosecutions focused on broader organizational dismantling. Calder attended the federal court hearing where Salazar was arraigned on charges that included conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, money laundering, and leading a continuing criminal enterprise. Salazar's attorney immediately began negotiating for cooperation agreements that would reduce his client's exposure in exchange for testimony against higher-level cartel members. The familiar pattern of criminals trading information for reduced sentences was ethically troubling but practically necessary for building cases against organizational leadership that remained insulated from direct evidence of criminal activity. The investigation produced seizures that the DEA publicized as a major victory against drug trafficking. Over 1,500 pounds of methamphetamine recovered from underwater caches, millions of dollars in assets frozen or seized, and a sophisticated distribution network disrupted. Press conferences celebrated the interagency cooperation and professional law enforcement work that had produced these results. But for Calder, standing at the back of the press conference room, the victory felt incomplete and unsatisfying. The community of Port Defiance had been revealed as compromised by criminal operations that had functioned for over a year, exploiting economic vulnerability and social isolation to establish infrastructure for trafficking that had moved poison into communities throughout the region. Dozens of local residents had been complicit through active participation or passive acceptance, their choices driven by a combination of financial desperation, fear, and the kind of moral compromise that occurred when people convinced themselves that looking away from criminal activity was less harmful than confronting it. Whitcomb found Calder after the press conference, his expression reflecting similar concerns about what the investigation had revealed and what it meant for the community they served. "Sheriff, what happens now to the people here who cooperated with the organization? The dock workers, the boat operators, the business owners who looked away when Salazar was operating. They're not going to face federal charges, but they still have to live in this community knowing that everyone understands what they did or didn't do." It was the question that haunted Calder as the federal investigation moved toward prosecutions, and the local community was left to process what had been revealed. They live with the consequences of their choices, Boaz. Some will leave, unable to face the judgment of neighbors who made different decisions. Others will stay and try to rebuild trust and reputations. The community will have to decide whether to offer forgiveness or maintain distance from people who facilitated criminal operations, even if they weren't directly involved in trafficking. Maud Ellery had completed her forensic analysis of the warehouse facility, finding no evidence of violent crimes beyond the drug trafficking operations. Her relief at not discovering additional victims was tempered by recognition that the investigation had still revealed profound corruption of a community's economic and social structures. "Sheriff Calder, in all my years of forensic work, I've rarely seen a case where the damage to community trust equaled the actual criminal harm. This investigation has exposed how vulnerable rural areas are to organized crime that understands how to exploit isolation and economic stress." The prosecutions that followed took place over the next year, resulting in convictions and lengthy sentences for Salazar and other organizational members who were tried in federal court. The 3 divers arrested during the initial interdiction received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, while lower-level participants who had cooperated with investigators faced no charges beyond having to live with the knowledge of their complicity. The underwater cash network was completely dismantled, with recovery operations retrieving containers from 7 different sites along the Washington coast. But the investigation's conclusion did nothing to address the underlying conditions that had made Port Defiance vulnerable to criminal infiltration. The economic struggles of commercial fishing remained. The geographic isolation that limited law enforcement presence continued, and the social dynamics that encouraged silence about suspicious activities persisted. Calder understood that without addressing these fundamental vulnerabilities, the community would remain susceptible to future criminal operations that might use different methods but would exploit the same weaknesses. 5 years after the investigation concluded, Calder stood once more on the Port Defiance dock watching fishing boats depart for their daily work. The harbor looked unchanged, the rhythms of maritime life continuing as they had for generations. But Calder knew that beneath the appearance of normalcy, the community carried scars from the revelation that neighbors had facilitated criminal operations, and that the ocean, which sustained their economy, had been used as infrastructure for trafficking poison. The investigation had demonstrated that rural isolation was not protection against sophisticated criminal operations, that economic vulnerability created opportunities for corruption, and that communities' reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths allowed organized crime to establish itself in ways that caused lasting damage. The lessons were painful but necessary, purchased through the kind of investigation that exposed not just criminal activity, but the social conditions that permitted it to flourish. Whitcomb continued leading the Marine Unit, now with enhanced training and resources for detecting maritime trafficking operations. The department had implemented reporting systems that made it easier for community members to share information about suspicious activity while maintaining confidentiality. Federal agencies had established regular liaison with coastal sheriffs to improve coordination and information sharing about potential trafficking operations. But the most important change was intangible, a recognition within the community that silence about criminal activity served no one's interests except the criminals themselves, and that protecting neighbors from consequences of their illegal activities ultimately damaged everyone. The culture that had allowed organized crime to operate openly for over a year was slowly shifting toward greater willingness to report suspicious activities and cooperate with law enforcement. Calder knew the change was fragile and incomplete, that economic pressures could still push people toward compromises they would regret, and that organized crime would continue probing for weaknesses in law enforcement and community resolve. But he also understood that investigations like the underwater cache case served purposes beyond prosecutions. They exposed vulnerabilities, demonstrated that criminal operations could be defeated, and reminded communities that their choices determined whether they would be victims of organized crime or participants in their own protection. The ocean that had concealed criminal operations for over a year continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to human struggles against the organizations that used its depths for evil purposes. But the community that depended on those waters had learned that vigilance was the price of safety, that cooperation with law enforcement served interests beyond individual concerns, and that the isolation which made their coastal home beautiful also made it vulnerable to those who understood that darkness flourished where people chose not to see.